Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. Quick question for my fellow crime junkies. Where are you watching this from right now? Midnight scrolling in bed? Headphones in at the gym? Sneaking an episode during lunch break? Tell me where in the world you are and what device you're on. I love seeing how this community shows up. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you're ready for more chilling stories. Tonight, the story being told is one that has haunted the city of Los Angeles for decades. It is a story that begins with love, sweet, hopeful, newlywed love, and ends in blood on a living room floor. It is a story about the worst kind of betrayal imaginable. Not the betrayal of a stranger breaking into your home. Not the betrayal of a random act of violence that nobody could have predicted. This is the betrayal of someone who swore an oath to protect and serve. Someone who carried a badge. Someone who knew exactly how police investigations worked and used every single piece of that knowledge to get away with murder for 23 long years. Let that number sink in for just a moment. 23 years. A child born the year of this crime would have been old enough to graduate college and start their own family before the truth finally came crawling out of the darkness. 23 years of a mother and father waking up every single morning knowing their daughter was gone, knowing someone had taken her, and not knowing who. 23 years of a community burying a crime it would eventually be forced to reckon with. 23 years of a killer putting on a uniform, going to work, climbing the ranks of a police department, attending retirement parties and department banquets, laughing at lunch, living her life, while the woman she murdered lay buried in the ground. This is the story of Sherry Rasmussen, and the woman who killed her. It begins, as so many stories like this one do, with something beautiful. Los Angeles in the early 1980s was a city on fire. Not literally, not yet, but culturally, electrically, alive with ambition and possibility. The highways gleamed in the California sun. The palm trees swayed in a warm, forgiving breeze. Young people poured into that city from all over the country chasing their version of the dream. Some of them wanted fame. Some of them wanted fortune. Some of them just wanted a life that was bigger and brighter and more alive than anything they could have imagined growing up in a small town somewhere flat and quiet. Sherry Ray Rasmussen was not chasing fame. She was not chasing fortune. What she was chasing, and what she had very nearly caught, was purpose. Sherry was born on February 7, 1957, in Loma Linda, California, a place known for its community of Seventh-day Adventists and its culture of health and care. She grew up in a family that loved her deeply, raised with strong values, with a sense of duty and compassion that would define everything she would go on to do. Sherry was bright. Not just academically bright, though she was certainly that. She was the kind of woman who lit up a room when she walked into it. The kind of woman who remembered your name after meeting you once. The kind of woman who, when you were in pain, made you feel like she was the only person in the world who could fix it. She went on to study nursing at Loma Linda University, and she did not just pass through that program. She excelled. She threw herself into the work with a level of dedication that her classmates and professors would remember for years. She understood, even as a young student, that nursing was not just a job. It was a calling. It was about being present in the most vulnerable moments of another person's life. It was about holding someone's hand in the dark when they were terrified. It was about being the steady, capable, compassionate force between a patient and their fear. By her late 20s, Sherry Rasmussen had already risen to a level that most nurses spend entire careers trying to reach. She had been appointed head nurse of UCLA's coronary care and observation unit. She had been named an unpaid assistant clinical professor of nursing, giving lectures and training the next generation of caregivers. And by the time she reached 29 years old, Sherry Rasmussen was the director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center, one of the top medical facilities in all of Southern California. At 29 years old, she ran the nursing department of a major hospital. Think about that for a moment. Think about what that says about the woman Sherry was. Think about the sheer force of character required to reach that level at that age in a field as demanding and as competitive as healthcare. This was not a woman who coasted. This was not a woman who let the world happen to her. Sherry Rasmussen went out and built her life with her own two hands, brick by patient, careful brick. And then, in the summer of 1984, at a party in Los Angeles, she met a man named John Rutan. John was handsome, charming, a mechanical engineering major from San Diego who had graduated from UCLA and was working for a tech company called Data Products. He was easy to be around. He had a warmth about him, a kind of easy California confidence that was appealing without being arrogant. And when he met Sherry at that party in June of 1984, something clicked between them that neither of them could quite explain or ignore. They started dating. And almost immediately, the people around them could see that this was real. This was not a casual Los Angeles romance, the kind that burns hot for 6 weeks and then fizzles out at a brunch somewhere. This was the real thing. Sherry called her parents to tell them about John with a kind of joy in her voice that her mother and father had not heard before. Her friends watched her fall in love, and they fell in love with the idea of her being in love. Everything about the way Sherry and John were together felt right. By November of 1985, John Rutten and Sherry Rasmussen stood before their family and friends and made a promise to each other. They got married. The photos from that wedding are everything you would expect them to be. Sherry radiant, her dark hair framing a face full of happiness, her smile so wide and so genuine that it almost hurts to look at those photographs knowing what was coming. John beside her, proud, in love, the two of them looking at each other the way people do when they cannot quite believe they found each other. They moved into a condominium together in Van Nuys, a neighborhood in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles. It was a nice place, comfortable, the kind of home that a young professional couple starts out in, the kind of place where you unpack your boxes and start arranging your furniture and argue pleasantly about where the couch should go and where you want to hang the pictures. The kind of place where you imagine your future taking shape around you. They had been married for exactly 3 months when everything ended. February 24th, 1986. It was a Monday. Sherry had stayed home from work that day. She had injured her back doing aerobics, and she was resting, taking it easy, alone in the condominium she shared with her husband while John went to work as he always did. It was a quiet, ordinary morning. The kind of morning that happens 10,000 times in a marriage. One partner goes to work, the other stays home. You say goodbye at the door, and you do not think twice about it because there is nothing about ordinary life that warns you that some goodbyes are the last ones. Sherry was home alone, and someone came to the door. What happened inside that condominium during the hours that followed is something the world would not fully understand for more than 23 years. But the evidence left behind in that apartment told a story, a brutal, horrifying, heartbreaking story that investigators would eventually learn to read. There had been a fight, a violent, desperate, savage struggle that moved through multiple rooms of that apartment. Sherry Rasmussen had not gone quietly. She had fought with everything she had. She had fought the way a woman fights when she knows she is fighting for her life. There was blood. There were overturned pieces of furniture. There were the marks of a confrontation that had gone on long enough to leave its traces in several different parts of the home. A ceramic vase had been used as a weapon, smashed against Sherry's head with enough force to cause serious trauma. She had been pistol whipped, the butt of a gun used as a club against the right side of her face, swelling and blackening her eye. And then, impossibly, horribly, 3 gunshots had torn through her chest. 3 shots fired into Sherry Rasmussen at close range, using what investigators believed was a pillow as an improvised silencer to muffle the sound so that no neighbors would hear. And on her left arm, in the flesh just above the wrist, a bite mark. Someone had bitten Sherry Rasmussen during the struggle with enough force to leave a clear impression in her skin. A bite mark that would lie preserved, waiting, sealed in an evidence envelope for decades. When John Rutten came home from work that evening and found his wife of 3 months lying dead on the floor of the home they had only just begun to build together, the world as he knew it stopped. Just stopped. Everything he thought the future held for him. The children they had talked about, the vacations they would take, the ordinary Tuesday evenings and the holiday mornings and the slow, accumulating joy of a shared life. All of it vanished in the space of a single moment. He called the police, and the investigation that followed would become one of the most catastrophic failures in the history of the Los Angeles Police Department. Not because the detectives who responded were bad people, not because they did not care, but because of a single, catastrophic assumption, an assumption that would cast its long shadow over the next 2 decades. The LAPD looked at that condominium. They saw the overturned furniture. They saw the stereo equipment that had been stacked near the front door. They saw the missing car. Sherry's BMW had been taken from the parking lot. and they drew a conclusion that felt, on the surface, entirely reasonable. This was a burglary gone wrong. Two men, they decided. Two men had broken into the apartment hoping to steal property, had encountered an unexpected victim who was home when she should not have been, and the situation had escalated into violence. It was a narrative that made sense. It was a narrative that fit the visible evidence. And it was a narrative that would keep the real killer free for 23 more years. Because while the LAPD was busy looking for two male burglars who did not exist, there was something sitting in the case file, something that Sherry's own father had told investigators, that should have changed the entire direction of the investigation from day one. Nels Rasmussen, Sherry's father, a man who had raised his daughter with love and who now had to figure out how to live in a world she was no longer part of, went to the police. He sat across from investigators and told them something they needed to hear. Sherry had been dealing with a problem, he explained. There was a woman, a former girlfriend of John's, who had been causing trouble, who had been intrusive, persistent, and who had, on more than one occasion, confronted Sherry directly. And this woman, Nels Rasmussen told the investigators, was a police officer. The detectives listened, and then they went back to looking for two male burglars. The name Nels Rasmussen had brought to them, though he did not know the name himself, only that she existed, would not be officially documented in any meaningful way. It would not be followed up on. It would not be investigated. It would sit in the edges of a case file that was slowly, steadily moving toward the back of a filing cabinet, toward the cold case shelf, toward 23 years of silence. Understanding why the LAPD made the assumptions they made in February of 1986 requires understanding what Los Angeles looked like at that time. The city was different then. Crime was different then. The San Fernando Valley, where Sherry and John's condominium sat, was not the sanitized suburban landscape it would partially become in later decades. The area saw its share of property crime, its share of home invasions, its share of violence that grew out of robbery and theft. A burglary gone wrong was not just a lazy conclusion. It was, statistically, a reasonable one. The detectives who arrived at that condominium on the evening of February 24, 1986, were working within a framework that made sense to them. They looked at the staging of the scene, the stereo equipment near the door, the BMW missing from the parking lot, the signs of a struggle, and they built a story around those facts that seemed to hold together. Two intruders. A confrontation with the occupant they did not expect. Violence that escalated beyond what anyone intended. A hasty retreat. It was clean. It was logical. And it was completely wrong. What the detectives failed to fully examine at the time was the nature of the violence itself. The fight that had taken place in that condominium was not the kind of fight that happens when a burglar wants to get out of a dangerous situation. A burglar who panics does not stay and beat someone repeatedly with a vase. A burglar who wants to escape does not pull out a gun and use a pillow to silence the shots, carefully, deliberately, one after another. A burglar who wants to grab the stereo and run does not take time to stage a scene. There was one investigator who, even back then, should have known better. Even in 1986, the bite mark on Sherry's arm was an unusual and significant piece of evidence. Bite marks are personal. They require physical proximity. They are acts of rage or desperation or passion. They are not the marks of a professional thief making a calculated escape. That bite mark was speaking to anyone who would listen, saying that what happened in that apartment was deeply, intensely personal. Nobody listened. Sherry's BMW was eventually recovered. A separate burglary in the neighborhood was investigated, and for a time investigators thought they might have found their two male suspects. There were men who matched a composite sketch, men with criminal records for property crime, men who lived in the general area. But nothing ever definitively linked any of them to Sherry's murder. The evidence simply was not there. The case began to stall almost immediately, and within months of that February day, the investigation had effectively ground to a halt. And so began the silence. The long, unbearable silence. For Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, Sherry's parents, silence was not something they were willing to accept. This was their daughter, their child. The woman who had called them on the phone just weeks before she died, happy and full of plans, talking about her work and her husband and what she wanted their life together to look like. The woman whose photograph sat on their mantelpiece and looked back at them every single morning with a smile that felt like an accusation. Not of them, never of them, but of the world that had failed her, of the investigation that had buried her case alongside her. They pushed. They called the detectives assigned to the case. They wrote letters. They offered rewards for information. They did everything that grieving parents do when they cannot accept that their daughter's killer is simply going to walk free. And in those conversations, Nels Rasmussen kept coming back to the same thing. That woman, John's ex-girlfriend, the police officer. Sherry had talked about her. Sherry had been unsettled by her. The woman had shown up at the hospital where Sherry worked. She had confronted Sherry directly, and the confrontation had been disturbing enough that Sherry had mentioned it to people who cared about her. The LAPD, for its part, acknowledged the family's concerns and continued to focus on the burglary theory. The file grew cold. The years began to pass. For a grieving family watching a case go nowhere, time does not heal wounds the way people say it does. It just makes the wounds deeper and the helplessness sharper. Every anniversary of Sherry's death was another knife. Every birthday that should have been celebrated was a reminder. Every year that passed without an arrest, without answers, without justice, was a year that the killer got to keep living their life, while the people who loved Sherry most had to figure out how to survive without her. John Ruetten tried to move on. Over the years, he would eventually remarry and build a new life, something that was his right, something that no one could or should begrudge him. But the loss of Sherry never fully left him. How could it? He was the one who had found her. He was the one who had come home to that apartment and walked through that door and seen his wife of 3 months lying dead on the floor. There is no version of a human being who fully recovers from something like that. What John Ruetten likely did not know, or at least did not fully understand at the time, was that he was at the center of something he had never chosen to be part of. The relationship he had maintained years earlier with a woman from his college days had not ended the way he thought it had. The casual, on-again, off-again connection that he had shared with a fellow UCLA student named Stephanie Lazarus in the early 1980s had, in the mind of that woman, been something far more significant than he ever intended it to be. Stephanie Lazarus and John Ruetten had met at UCLA. They had both lived in Dykstra Hall, a dormitory on the Westwood campus. And in the way of young people at university, they had drifted into each other's orbit and eventually into each other's beds. Ruetten would later testify, painfully, that by his accounting they had been intimate approximately 20 to 30 times over the course of several years, but that he had never considered Lazarus his girlfriend. He had, in his own mind, always seen their connection as casual, as friendly, as something without the weight of commitment. For Stephanie Lazarus, it appears the story was very different. She had graduated from UCLA with a degree in political science and sociology and had gone directly into the Los Angeles Police Department, completing a special 8-week pre-academy training program before graduating and becoming a uniformed officer in 1983. Her classmates at the academy remembered her well. They noted that she was tenacious, particularly during physical combat training, particularly in the exercises that involved weapons. She was the kind of officer who held on when others let go. She was the kind of officer who did not back down. During her time at the academy, Lazarus spoke about Ruetten as her college boyfriend. She was his date at a company Christmas party in 1983. By her own internal accounting, there was a relationship there, a real one, a meaningful one. And when Ruetten began to pull away from that connection, when he met Sherry Rasmussen at a party in 1984 and his attention shifted, something in Stephanie Lazarus did not accept it. Upon joining the force, Lazarus had purchased a Smith & Wesson Model 49, a .38 caliber revolver, through the department as her backup firearm. A small, concealable handgun. Exactly the kind of weapon that would be consistent with the ballistic evidence left in the body of Sherry Rasmussen. The timeline of what happened between late 1984 and February of 1986 is a timeline built largely from fragments. From what Sherry told her family, from what colleagues remembered, from the few interactions that were documented. But the picture that emerges from those fragments is disturbing. Stephanie Lazarus, it appears, was not prepared to simply accept that John Ruetten had moved on. There were phone calls. There were attempts at contact. And at some point, Lazarus went to the hospital where Sherry worked and confronted her directly. Sherry told her family about this. The confrontation had frightened her. It had unsettled her in the way that only a confrontation from someone who seems dangerously determined can unsettle you. She had not wanted to make a scene. She had not wanted to go to the police. And what would she have said? That her husband's former casual acquaintance had come to her workplace? That a woman had talked to her in a way that felt wrong? There was nothing concrete. There was no crime. There was just a feeling, the kind of sick, instinctive feeling that women are taught from childhood to suppress and talk themselves out of. That something about this situation was not safe. Sherry Rasmussen and John Rutten were married in November of 1985. By February 24, 1986, just 3 months into their marriage, Sherry was dead. The investigation that followed those early months stumbled badly, and then it stumbled again, and then it essentially stopped. Witnesses were interviewed. Leads were pursued. The theory of the two male burglars was tested against the available evidence and came up short, but the department never fully abandoned it. There was even, at one point, a separate burglary in the neighborhood that seemed to offer a possible connection. A woman had interrupted 2 men in her home. A sketch had been drawn of the suspects, but nothing in the physical evidence of Sherry's murder ever definitively linked those men to what had happened in the Van Nuys condominium. The case was classified as unsolved. It went cold. And the killer, who had worn a uniform, who had sworn an oath, who had sat in a patrol car and driven the streets of Los Angeles wearing the badge and the authority of the Los Angeles Police Department, continued to go to work, continued to receive promotions, continued to build a career. Stephanie Lazarus rose through the ranks of the LAPD over the following decades. She became a detective. She was eventually assigned to the art theft unit, a prestigious, specialized assignment that required intelligence, patience, and investigative skill. She was, by all professional accounts, a good officer, a capable one. Nobody at the LAPD looked at Stephanie Lazarus and saw a murderer. Why would they? She was one of them. She was a colleague, a friend, a fellow officer who had dedicated her career to catching criminals. The idea that one of their own could have committed a crime this serious, this intimate, this calculated, and then walked back into the department the next morning and kept working, was almost impossible to hold in the mind. But it was true. It was exactly what had happened. And while Stephanie Lazarus was walking those halls, the Rasmussen family was still waiting, still pushing, still unable to let their daughter's story end without a period at the end of the sentence, still waking up every morning with her name on their lips and the weight of her absence on their chests. The case file sat in a drawer somewhere in the LAPD, growing dusty, growing old. And inside that file, sealed in an evidence envelope that had never been opened, that had been collected at the crime scene in 1986 and stored without ever being examined, was the answer. The bite mark on Sherry Rasmussen's arm had been swabbed for biological material in 1986. That swab had been packaged carefully and placed into evidence storage. DNA testing did not exist in any usable forensic form in 1986. The technology would not be developed and refined for criminal cases until the late 1980s and into the 1990s. But when they collected that swab, investigators were following their instincts, preserving what they could, keeping what might one day be useful. It sat there in the evidence room for more than 15 years. Waiting. The science of DNA changed everything. Not just for the Rasmussen case, not just for one family or one city or one police department, but for the entire architecture of criminal justice in the modern world. To understand what happened to the Sherry Rasmussen investigation in the years that followed that cold February in 1986, it is necessary to understand the revolution that transformed the way human beings solve crimes. Deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, is the biological blueprint of every living creature. It is the code written in every cell, the instruction manual of the body, and it is as unique to an individual human being as a fingerprint, only far more precise. Every person on Earth carries their own specific genetic signature in every drop of blood, every strand of hair, every piece of skin, every trace of biological material their body produces or leaves behind. And in the mid-1980s, a British geneticist named Alec Jeffreys developed a technique that allowed scientists to read those signatures, to look at a piece of biological evidence from a crime scene and match it, with extraordinary accuracy, to a specific individual. The world of criminal investigation was never the same again. The first DNA exoneration in the United States happened in 1989. The first successful DNA prosecution had taken place in the United Kingdom in 1986, the same year Sherry Rasmussen was murdered. By the early 1990s, DNA evidence was being accepted in American courtrooms with increasing frequency. Cases that had gone cold for years were suddenly being reopened. Evidence that had been collected and stored without any real ability to analyze it was being pulled out of evidence rooms across the country and sent to laboratories. The implications were staggering. For law enforcement, DNA meant that the past was no longer beyond reach. A crime committed before the technology existed could still be solved if the right biological material had been preserved. A killer who had walked free for a decade, for 2 decades, for 3, could still be identified if their DNA was left somewhere at the scene of the crime. The clock had not stopped. The evidence had been waiting, patient and silent, for science to catch up. For the Rasmussen family, this revolution arrived slowly. It did not descend on them all at once with a clarifying light. It filtered in through news reports about other cases being solved, other families getting answers, other killers being identified and brought to justice after years of freedom. And each one of those stories that the Rasmussen family saw or read or heard about was a reminder of what they still did not have. An answer, a name, a face to put to the thing that had taken Sherry from them. The Los Angeles Police Department, to its credit, established a cold case unit in 2001. The formation of this unit was a recognition of the new reality that DNA had created, that cold cases were no longer necessarily cold forever, that advances in forensic technology had made it possible to revisit old evidence with new eyes and new tools, and sometimes reach conclusions that had been impossible before. The unit was staffed by experienced detectives who understood both the investigative work of building a case and the scientific work of understanding what the evidence could and could not tell them. Detective Cliff Shepard was among the first to revisit the Rasmussen file. When he pulled it out and went through it carefully, he found the swab. The bite mark swab that had been collected in 1986 and stored for 15 years without ever being submitted for analysis. Shepard recognized immediately what that swab represented. He sent it to the laboratory. The process of extracting and analyzing DNA from a 15-year-old biological sample is not simple. The material degrades over time. Environmental factors, temperature, humidity, handling, can affect the quality and viability of the sample. The laboratory technicians who worked on the Rasmussen swab were dealing with material that had been in storage since 1986, material that had never been processed, material whose integrity was an open question. This was painstaking, delicate scientific work, but the swab yielded results. In 2004, 18 years after the murder of Sherry Rasmussen, a DNA profile was successfully extracted from the bite mark evidence. And the profile confirmed something that should have been obvious to any investigator who looked at the nature of that crime with clear eyes, but which had somehow never been fully articulated in the investigation. The DNA from the bite mark belonged to a woman. The killer was female. Every assumption that had been built around the burglary theory, the 2 male intruders, the property crime gone wrong, the random violence of strangers looking for a quick score, collapsed in an instant. What had happened in that condominium on February 24, 1986 was not a burglary. It had never been a burglary. It was something far more intimate and far more terrifying. Sherry Rasmussen had not been killed by someone who wanted her television set. She had been killed by someone who wanted her life. Someone who had walked into that apartment with a specific purpose, a specific target, a specific rage. The investigation was reopened. But the momentum that should have followed that 2004 discovery did not materialize as quickly or as decisively as it should have. The DNA profile was in the system. It was being compared against the database of known offenders. The results came back without a match. Whoever had left their DNA on Sherry Rasmussen's arm was not in the system. They had no prior convictions. They had not been arrested for anything that would have placed their genetic material in the database. And so once again, the investigation stalled. Not completely. The file was now active. The DNA profile was out there. The question of a female perpetrator was on the table, but without a name to attach to the profile, without a suspect to test, the investigation was spinning in place. Leads were thin. The passage of nearly 2 decades had made witnesses harder to find, memories harder to rely on, physical evidence harder to work with. The case was not cold exactly, but it was not moving forward. It remained in that frustrating middle space, too alive to be buried, too stalled to be solved, for several more years. And then in 2009, a detective named Jim Nuttall picked up the Rasmussen file one more time. His assignment was to give it one final, thorough review before making a decision about its ultimate fate. Nuttall went through every page. He read every interview transcript, every investigative note, every piece of documentation that had been generated in the 23 years since Sherry's death. And he stopped on something that other investigators had either missed or dismissed, or simply not followed to its logical conclusion. The stereo equipment. The stereo equipment that had been stacked near the front door, the stereo equipment that the original investigators had used as evidence of a burglary in progress, had Sherry Rasmussen's blood on it. Think about what that means. The blood on the stereo equipment told Nuttall that Sherry was already dead, or very nearly dead, when the equipment was placed near the door. Because blood does not end up on the stereo of a living, fighting woman unless she was bleeding when that stereo was being moved. Which meant the sequence of events was not what anyone had originally assumed. The violence had come first. The staging of the burglary had come second. And that changed everything. Because if the staging happened after the violence, after Sherry was dead, then whoever staged that scene was not a panicking burglar trying to escape a confrontation they had not expected. They were a calculating killer covering their tracks. They had chosen to take the time, after shooting and beating and biting Sherry Rasmussen to death, to walk around the apartment and arrange things to look like a robbery, to take the car, to create a narrative that would mislead investigators. That level of deliberateness, that level of cold, calculated post-crime behavior, pointed directly and unmistakably to a premeditated murder. Not a crime of opportunity, a crime of intention. Nuttall looked at this with fresh eyes and reached the conclusion that the original investigators either could not or would not reach. This was a targeted killing. This was personal, and the DNA told him it was done by a woman. He went back to the beginning. He went back to the people who had known Sherry in her life. He spoke to her family, to her colleagues, to John Rutan. And when he spoke to Rutan, he asked the question that should have been answered definitively 23 years earlier. Were there any women in Sherry's life who might have had reason to want to harm her? John Rutan told Nuttall that he had given a name to investigators back in 1986. He had mentioned, in those early days of the investigation, the name of a former girlfriend, a woman from his UCLA days, a woman who had remained persistent in her connection to him even after he had moved on, even after he had become engaged to Sherry, a woman who was, at the time, an officer with the LAPD. Rutan told Nuttall that the conversation he had had with investigators back in 1986 had apparently never been formally documented. There was no official record of him providing that name. Whatever he had said about Stephanie Lazarus in those early days of the investigation had not made it into the case file in any meaningful way. Nuttall felt the weight of that realization settle over him. He began building a list. He identified 5 women who might have had a reason, however remote, to have wanted Sherry Rasmussen dead. He went through the list methodically, carefully, the way good detective work demands. 3 of the 5 women were quickly eliminated. Sherry's sister, her mother, and a close friend all provided DNA samples voluntarily and were cleared. The 4th, a nurse at the hospital where Sherry had worked who was believed to have had a professional dispute with her, was also cleared through DNA. That left one name, the 5th name on the list. The name that Nels Rasmussen had tried to give investigators 23 years ago. The name that John Rutan said he had mentioned and that had somehow never been formally followed up on. The name of the woman who had confronted Sherry at her workplace. The name of the woman who had pursued John Rutan even after he had made his choice. Stephanie Lazarus. By 2009, Stephanie Lazarus was no longer a patrol officer. She was a detective. She had spent 25 years with the LAPD, climbing steadily through the ranks, building a career that her colleagues respected and that her superiors regarded with approval. She was 50 years old. She was, from all outward appearances, exactly what she appeared to be, a veteran law enforcement professional with a long and distinguished record of service. The moment Jim Nuttall focused his attention on Stephanie Lazarus was the moment the case that had been frozen for 23 years began, slowly, inexorably, to thaw. Investigating a fellow officer for murder is not something that any police department does lightly. It is not a decision that is made quickly or casually. There are protocols, and there are politics, and there are the complicated, layered relationships that develop over decades of shared work, shared danger, and shared identity. When you put on a badge, you become part of something. A tribe. A brotherhood and sisterhood of people who have chosen to do a job that most people would never take. That bond is real and it is powerful, and it does not dissolve easily even when evidence begins to point in directions that are difficult and uncomfortable. Detective Jim Nuttall understood all of this. He understood it viscerally, from the inside, because he was part of that same tribe. He wore the same badge. He had built his career in the same department. And the evidence that was beginning to accumulate around the name Stephanie Lazarus was evidence that, if he followed it to its conclusion, would tear through the fabric of the LAPD in ways that would not be easy for anyone to absorb. But Nuttall was a detective, and detectives follow the evidence. That is the job. The investigation that was built around Stephanie Lazarus over the weeks and months that followed Nuttall's decision to focus on her was conducted with extraordinary care and extraordinary secrecy. The team of investigators working the case understood something fundamental. If Lazarus figured out that she was being looked at, the entire investigation could be compromised. She was not just anyone. She was a trained law enforcement professional who understood exactly how investigations worked, who knew what detectives needed to build a case, and who would know, if she became aware that she was a suspect, precisely what steps to take to protect herself. So the investigation was kept tight. The circle of people who knew what was being looked at was kept deliberately small. Every step was planned and executed with a precision that reflected both the seriousness of the target and the enormous stakes of getting it wrong. Nuttall and his team began by building a comprehensive picture of Stephanie Lazarus, not just who she was professionally, but who she had been in 1986. They wanted to understand the timeline. They wanted to understand the relationship between Lazarus and Rutan, the confrontations between Lazarus and Sherry, the circumstances that surrounded the murder. What they found was chilling. The relationship between Stephanie Lazarus and John Rutan had, by Rutan's own account, been a casual one, something physical without real emotional commitment, at least from his side. But the evidence of Lazarus's behavior in the period leading up to Sherry's murder told a different story about how Lazarus herself perceived things. She had not simply moved on when Rutan's attention shifted. She had not accepted the natural end of something that had never been formally begun. She had continued to pursue him. She had shown up at his workplace. And she had gone to the hospital where Sherry Rasmussen worked as the director of nursing and confronted Sherry directly. Multiple people confirmed that the confrontation had taken place. Sherry had talked about it. She had told people she was disturbed by it, that the woman's intensity had frightened her. She had tried to handle it quietly, without escalation, the way women so often try to handle situations that feel threatening, hoping that if they do not push back too hard, the problem will simply go away. The problem did not go away. Rutan had even admitted, in testimony that would become publicly known years later, something that adds an excruciating layer to the already devastating story. He had slept with Lazarus again after becoming engaged to Sherry. This detail is important not because it shifts any responsibility for what happened. Nothing Rutan did or did not do justifies or explains the murder of his wife, but because it speaks to the state of Lazarus's understanding of the situation. If Rutan was still willing to be with her even while engaged to someone else, then in the warped logic of obsession, perhaps Lazarus told herself that he had not truly made his choice. Perhaps she told herself that there was still a chance. Perhaps the marriage itself, when it happened in November of 1985, felt to Lazarus not like a closed door, but like a wall that needed to be removed. The gun was another piece of the picture. Lazarus had purchased a Smith & Wesson Model 49, a .38 caliber revolver, when she joined the LAPD. It was her backup firearm, her department-sanctioned second weapon. And shortly after Sherry Rasmussen's murder, that gun, or a gun of the same make and caliber, was reported stolen. The timing of that reported theft was, to put it gently, convenient. A .38 caliber weapon had been used to fire the 3 shots that killed Sherry Rasmussen. And Stephanie Lazarus's .38 caliber backup gun was reported missing in the period immediately following the murder. The investigators could not prove, at this stage, that the gun was the same one. The weapon had never been recovered. But the caliber match, the timing of the reported theft, and the identity of the person reporting it added yet another thread to the growing web of evidence that was quietly being woven around Stephanie Lazarus. All of this was significant. All of this was damning, in its way. But none of it was the DNA. And in the modern world of criminal prosecution, in a case where the defense would inevitably argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that the case was built on coincidence and inference and 23-year-old memories, DNA was what the prosecution needed. A direct, scientifically precise, irrefutable biological connection between Stephanie Lazarus and the murder of Sherry Rasmussen. They had the DNA profile from the bite mark. What they needed was a sample from Lazarus to compare it against. And here was the problem. They could not simply walk up to Stephanie Lazarus and ask for a DNA sample. If they did that, she would know she was a suspect. She would likely refuse. She would certainly lawyer up. And in doing so, she would alert herself to the investigation that was being conducted around her, giving her time and opportunity to respond in ways that could compromise the case. The entire strategy of keeping the investigation secret would unravel in a moment. No, if they were going to get Lazarus's DNA, they were going to have to get it without her knowing she had given it. The legal framework for this kind of operation is well established in American law. An individual in a public space does not have a legal expectation of privacy regarding items they voluntarily discard. If a person throws something away, a coffee cup, a straw, a used tissue, in a public trash can, law enforcement can legally retrieve that item and use any biological material on it for testing without a warrant. It is a form of evidence collection that has been used in many high-profile investigations, and when done properly, the results are legally admissible. The decision was made. A surveillance operation would be mounted. Stephanie Lazarus would be followed, discreetly, carefully, with a small and trusted team who understood exactly what was at stake. They would wait for an opportunity to retrieve something she discarded, something that carried her DNA, something that could be compared against the profile extracted from the bite mark on Sherry Rasmussen's arm. This is the kind of police work that does not look like the movies. There are no dramatic car chases. There are no confrontations in dark alleys. There is just patience, hours and hours of patient surveillance, following a woman through her daily life, watching where she goes, what she does, waiting for the right moment. It requires discipline and focus and the ability to hold in your mind, through all the ordinary tedium of the watching, the knowledge of what is really at stake. The surveillance team followed Stephanie Lazarus for days. They watched her routine. They moved carefully, always at a distance that would not attract her attention, always mindful that this was a trained detective who would recognize surveillance techniques if she ever had reason to suspect she was being watched. And then it happened. Lazarus made a stop at a Costco warehouse store in the area. She went inside. She got herself a drink, the kind of large fountain drink that Costco locations serve in their food court area. She came back out, and when she was done with the drink, she discarded the cup and the straw in a trash can outside the store. The surveillance team was watching. They waited until Lazarus was gone, until she was out of sight, around a corner, at a safe distance. And then, with the kind of careful, practiced efficiency that speaks to many hours of exactly this kind of work, they retrieved the cup from the trash. The cup and the straw were packaged carefully and transported to the laboratory. And now came the waiting. The agonizing, essential, absolutely necessary waiting that is the price of scientific precision. The laboratory technicians would work through the biological material on the straw. They would extract the DNA. They would generate a profile. And they would compare that profile against the one that had been sitting in the evidence file since 2004, the profile extracted from the bite mark left on Sherry Rasmussen's arm in 1986. The detectives waited. They had spent years on this case. Years of reading through old files and chasing old leads and sitting with the knowledge of what might have happened while the evidence to prove it sat just out of reach. They had risked their careers and their reputations by pursuing a fellow officer when everything in the culture of law enforcement said that you do not do that, not without ironclad evidence, not without being absolutely sure. They had conducted a surveillance operation with the secrecy and precision of a covert intelligence mission. And now there was nothing left to do but wait for the laboratory to speak. The results came back. The DNA extracted from the straw, from the drink cup that Stephanie Lazarus had discarded in a trash can outside a Costco, was a perfect match to the DNA profile extracted from the bite mark on Sherry Rasmussen's arm. The woman who had bitten Sherry Rasmussen during the fight that ended her life was Stephanie Lazarus. The woman who had spent 23 years going to work in the same police department that had been assigned to solve Sherry's murder was the one who had committed it. Jim Nuttall and his team sat with that knowledge for a moment. Let it land. Let it be real. And then they went to work. A DNA match is not an arrest. It is not a conviction. It is not the end of a story. It is a turning point in one. The moment when everything that has been uncertain suddenly crystallizes into certainty. But between that crystallization and the moment of justice lies a complicated, careful, legally and strategically demanding stretch of work that requires as much precision as the DNA testing itself. Nuttall and his team now had the biological link they needed. The profile from Lazarus's DNA matched the profile from the bite mark with the kind of statistical certainty that makes arguments about coincidence essentially impossible. The probability that the match was accidental, that two different women happened to share the precise genetic signature that showed up on that evidence, was, for all practical purposes, zero. The science was conclusive, but the team also understood that a case built on DNA evidence alone, while powerful, is a case that can still be attacked in court. A skilled defense attorney would look for every possible angle. Contamination of the sample, chain of custody problems with the evidence, questions about how the DNA had been collected and stored over the decades. The prosecution would need DNA plus context, DNA plus motive, DNA plus the full, rich, detailed picture of Stephanie Lazarus and Sherry Rasmussen and John Ruetten and the events of 1986 that made the match not just scientifically inevitable, but narratively coherent. They needed to talk to Lazarus. This was perhaps the most delicate calculation of the entire investigation. Lazarus was a seasoned detective. She had spent a quarter-century conducting interrogations herself. She understood the rhythms of police questioning, the way investigators build rapport before shifting to pressure, the way questions are designed to seem casual while actually boxing a suspect in. She would recognize an interrogation if it announced itself as one. And if she recognized it, she would shut it down immediately, and she would be within her legal rights to do so. So the decision was made to bring Lazarus in under a different pretense. She would be told that investigators wanted to speak with her about an unrelated matter, a different case, something that would not set off alarm bells, that would not alert her to the real nature of the meeting, that would allow the detectives to get her into a room and talking before she understood what was actually happening. On June 5, 2009, Stephanie Lazarus was brought into LAPD headquarters for what she was told was a routine conversation. She walked in looking like exactly what she was, a veteran detective, confident, at ease in her environment, in familiar surroundings, surrounded by colleagues, and the institutional apparatus of a career she had given most of her adult life to. She sat down across from the investigators, and she was calm, relaxed even, because she had no reason, in her mind, to be anything other than calm. 23 years had passed. The case was cold, or had been cold, or at least she had every reason to believe it was. She had survived the initial investigation. She had survived the years. She had survived the departmental inquiries that had gone nowhere. She was a detective with a long and respected career, and she was sitting in a room with colleagues having what appeared to be a routine conversation. The interview began with small talk, the kind of conversational ease-in that detectives use to establish a baseline, to get a sense of how the subject communicates, how they move and breathe and respond to ordinary questions before the ordinary questions stop being ordinary. And then, carefully, almost imperceptibly, the conversation began to shift. The investigators moved toward the Rasmussen case gradually. They mentioned John Ruetten. They mentioned that the investigation into his wife's death had been recently revisited. They watched Lazarus's face and body language as the conversation moved from the comfortable to the uncomfortable. At first, Lazarus remained composed. She acknowledged knowing John Ruetten. She was careful, measured, choosing her words with the practiced caution of someone who knows that everything said in a room like this one can be used against them, though she still appeared to believe, at this point, that the conversation was general, exploratory, that she was being consulted, perhaps, as a former acquaintance of a person connected to the case, not as a suspect. But the investigators pressed. They asked more specific questions. They asked about her relationship with Ruetten. They asked about the period around the time of the murder. They asked about events and details that could only matter if she was being looked at as more than a witness. Something shifted in Lazarus as the nature of the conversation became clearer to her. The composure held, but differently, held now with conscious effort, with the controlled stillness of someone who is choosing how to be rather than simply being. She knew something was wrong. She did not know, at that precise moment, exactly how much they had. But she knew enough. She began to reveal small inconsistencies. Answers that seemed slightly off from what the evidence suggested. Details she knew with a specificity that would be unusual for someone with only a casual connection to the case. There were moments in the transcript of that interview that would later be pored over by legal analysts and journalists and true crime researchers. Moments where what Lazarus said, and how she said it, and what she stopped herself from saying, spoke volumes. At one point during the interview, the investigators asked Lazarus about the DNA evidence. They told her that new testing had been conducted on evidence from the crime scene. They told her that the results had been significant. They asked her if she would be willing to provide a DNA sample. The room changed. Lazarus understood. Perhaps not with complete certainty, but enough. She understood that the question about DNA was not a procedural formality. It was the endgame. It was the moment that the investigators had been working toward, the moment when all the patient, careful groundwork of the previous months came to a head. She said, "I mean, if you guys are claiming that I'm a suspect, then, I got a problem with that." And then she asked for a lawyer. In the American legal system, the moment a suspect invokes their right to counsel, interrogation must stop. The investigators stopped. The interview ended. There was nothing more to be done in that room. But there was something to be done outside of it. Stephanie Lazarus was escorted out of the interrogation room. She walked into the hallway of LAPD headquarters, the same building she had worked in for years, the corridors she had walked thousands of times, the familiar institutional spaces of a career built on the premise that she was one of the good ones. And the moment she stepped through that door, she was surrounded. Detectives placed her under arrest and charged her with the first-degree murder of Sherry Rasmussen. The news hit the Los Angeles Police Department like a physical blow. The corridors of the organization that had employed her for 25 years buzzed with something that was not quite shock, because shock implies that no one could have seen it coming, but with a stunned, nauseating reckoning. One of their own. A detective. Someone who had walked these same halls, attended the same briefings, participated in the same investigations, eaten in the same cafeteria. Someone who had, for 23 years, been part of the apparatus that was theoretically supposed to be solving the very crime she had committed. The story broke publicly within days. The Los Angeles media landscape exploded with it. The Rasmussen case, which had been a cold case file for more than 2 decades, was suddenly one of the most talked about stories in the city. Former colleagues of Lazarus were interviewed and struggled to articulate what they felt. The family of Sherry Rasmussen, after 23 years of waiting and pushing and never fully giving up, received a phone call that they had begun, in the darkest corners of their hearts, to fear might never come. Nels Rasmussen, who had walked into a police station more than 2 decades ago and tried to tell investigators that John Rutan's ex-girlfriend, a cop, was worth looking at, now knew that he had been right all along. All along. The pain of that knowledge, of being right for 23 years and being ignored for 23 years while the killer continued to breathe and work and live, is not something that can be adequately put into words. Nels and Loretta Rasmussen had not just lost their daughter. They had spent more than 2 decades fighting to be heard, and now they understood exactly what that silence had cost. Stephanie Lazarus was arraigned on June 9, 2009, and pleaded not guilty to the charge of first-degree murder. She was taken into custody. After 25 years on the force, her career with the LAPD was over. And the long road to justice, the road that should have been much shorter, the road that wound through 23 years of darkness and delay and institutional failure, was finally approaching its destination. Between the arrest of Stephanie Lazarus in June of 2009 and the beginning of her trial, the world had time to absorb what had happened. And the more the details emerged, not just the facts of the crime itself, but the extraordinary circumstances surrounding it, the more the story of Sherry Rasmussen and her killer settled into a particular place in the public consciousness. This was not just a murder case. This was something that cut deeper, something that raised questions that went beyond who did what and when. How does a police officer commit murder and then go back to work the next morning? How does a person spend 25 years in law enforcement, 25 years surrounded by the tools and the colleagues and the institutional apparatus designed to uncover exactly this kind of crime, and keep that secret intact? How does a department fail to notice that one of its own, someone working in the same building as the investigators assigned to the case, was the very person they were looking for? And perhaps most painfully, most urgently, what would have happened if Nels Rasmussen had been listened to in 1986? If the investigators who sat across from that grieving father in those early days of the investigation had taken seriously what he was telling them, that there was a woman, that she was a police officer, that Sherry had been disturbed by her, would Stephanie Lazarus have been identified and arrested weeks or months after the murder? Would she have gone to prison in 1986 instead of 2009? Would 23 years of the Rasmussen family's grief have been cut short at its very beginning? There is an additional layer to this story that is even darker, and it did not become fully public until the trial and the investigations that followed. Some of the police files that were examined in the course of the renewed investigation suggested that evidence which could have implicated Lazarus earlier in the process had been tampered with or removed. Lazarus herself had plausibly had access to those files during the 1990s. As an officer in the department, she would have had opportunities, if she chose to take them, to examine the documentation of the case that was nominally investigating her crime. Whether she took advantage of that access, and what she may or may not have done with it, is something that was never conclusively proven. But the suggestion alone, the possibility that an officer under the shadow of suspicion may have interfered with the investigation of her own crime, adds a dimension to this story that is almost beyond comprehension. It speaks to a confidence, a coldness, an audacity that is difficult to square with the image of a normal human being. Whatever Stephanie Lazarus told herself about what she had done, whatever justifications or rationalizations or mental constructs she built around the fact that she had walked into a woman's home and beaten her and shot her and staged the scene to mislead investigators, she had sustained that internal structure for 23 years with enough stability to keep working, keep advancing, keep presenting the face of a law-abiding officer to the world. The trial itself, when it finally began in 2012, was a meticulous, methodical presentation of evidence that the prosecution had been carefully building since Lazarus's arrest 3 years earlier. The lead prosecutor laid out the case in its full complexity, the history of the relationship between Lazarus and Rutan, the timeline of events leading up to the murder, the crime scene evidence, the DNA analysis, and the story of how the investigation had finally found its way to the truth. The defense, as expected, challenged the DNA evidence. Lazarus's attorneys argued that the sample was too old, the testing too prone to error, the chain of custody too complicated. They questioned the credibility of the laboratory analysis and the conclusions that had been drawn from it. They tried to find the gaps, the spaces in the evidence where doubt could take root. But the DNA was solid. The prosecution's forensic experts testified with confidence and precision about the process by which the profile had been extracted and the match confirmed. The science was unimpeachable. Beyond the DNA, the prosecution built a portrait of Stephanie Lazarus in the period leading up to the murder that was damning in its accumulated weight. Witnesses testified to her obsessive pursuit of Rutan. The confrontation at Sherry's hospital was described in detail. The timeline of the marriage and the murder, 3 months between the wedding and the death, was laid before the jury with all its terrible implication. The gun that had been reported stolen, the caliber match, the staged scene, and what it said about the calculated nature of what had taken place. Lazarus maintained her innocence throughout the trial. She did not take the stand, which is her right under the Fifth Amendment of the American Constitution, and which is a right that no jury is supposed to hold against a defendant. But the weight of the evidence was not something that any legal maneuver could fully neutralize. The jury deliberated, and on March 8, 2012, 26 years after Sherry Rasmussen was killed in the home she shared with her husband of 3 months, the verdict was delivered. Guilty. First-degree murder. Stephanie Lazarus, who had spent 25 years as a police officer and detective with the Los Angeles Police Department, who had risen from a uniformed patrol officer to a detective in the prestigious art theft unit, who had attended retirement parties and departmental functions and all the ordinary ceremonies of a career in public service. Stephanie Lazarus was found guilty of murdering Sherry Rasmussen. She was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. The sentence was greeted by the Rasmussen family with something that was not quite relief, not quite joy, but something that sat in the complicated emotional space between those two things. Justice, when it comes after 26 years, does not feel the way it might have felt if it had come sooner. It does not undo the years. It does not give back the time. It does not return Sherry to her parents or her sister or the life she was building with John Ruetten. It does not erase the mornings that her mother and father woke up in a world where she was gone. It does not mend anything, exactly, but it names the truth. It says, officially, publicly, irrevocably, that this is what happened. That Sherry Rasmussen was a person whose life had value and whose death was a crime and whose killer has been found and will be held accountable. That matters. That is not nothing. For a family that has been fighting for that basic recognition for more than 2 decades, the verdict was the end of a war. Not a happy ending, but an ending nonetheless. Nels Rasmussen, who had first told investigators to look at John Ruetten's ex-girlfriend in 1986 and who had spent 23 years being ignored, did not live to see the conviction. He died in 2009, the same year Lazarus was arrested. He died knowing that an arrest had finally been made, knowing that the machinery of justice had finally been set in motion, but without the final confirmation of the verdict that would have validated everything he had known and said and fought for. Loretta Rasmussen, Sherry's mother, and Connie Rasmussen, her sister, were present in that courtroom in March of 2012 when the verdict was read. They heard the word that had been so long in coming. Guilty. Sherry's sister Connie would go on to be one of the family's most vocal and powerful voices in the years that followed, not just in speaking about the loss of her sister, but in opposing the parole hearings that would eventually take place as Lazarus became eligible for early release under California's youthful offender laws. Connie's voice, steady and fierce and full of the grief that never fully heals, has been one of the ways in which Sherry Rasmussen has continued to be remembered, not just as a case, but as a person. As a woman who deserved better. As a daughter, a sister, a wife, a nurse, a human being whose life was full of meaning and whose death was an outrage. The story of the case did not end with the conviction. Nothing, it seems, ever ends cleanly. Stephanie Lazarus was sentenced and taken to prison. And then, years later, the machinery of the California criminal justice system began to raise the possibility of her release. There is a particular kind of agony that belongs to the families of murder victims when the legal system, having finally delivered its verdict, begins the long process of revisiting that verdict through the mechanisms of appeal and parole. It is an agony that people who have not experienced it firsthand struggle to fully understand. The sense that justice, once achieved at such tremendous cost, is somehow provisional, subject to revision, never quite permanent enough to feel like safety. For the Rasmussen family, that agony arrived in the years following Stephanie Lazarus's conviction, as the California prison and parole system began its periodic assessment of her eligibility for release. The framework that would eventually be invoked on Lazarus's behalf was a 2018 California law designed to address the science of adolescent and young adult brain development. Specifically, the evidence that certain parts of the human brain responsible for impulse control and decision-making are not fully mature until a person's mid to late 20s. The law was designed to ensure that people who committed serious crimes when they were under 26 years old had meaningful opportunities for parole review, based on the principle that the brain they were operating with at the time of their crime was not the brain of a fully mature adult. Stephanie Lazarus was 25 years old when she killed Sherry Rasmussen. She fell within the scope of the law. The first parole hearing came in November of 2023, 37 years after the murder, 11 years after the conviction. And what happened at that hearing stopped the Rasmussen family cold. A panel of parole commissioners, after hearing testimony and reviewing the evidence of Lazarus's conduct in prison, found her suitable for release. She was, according to the panel, a model prisoner. She had spent her years behind bars not idle but productive. She had established a non-profit organization that supplied women inmates with textbooks. She had mentored younger prisoners. She had maintained an excellent disciplinary record. And she had, at this hearing, done something she had never done before in public or in any legal forum. She confessed. Not everything. Not in the way the family needed. But she acknowledged, for the first time, that she had killed Sherry Rasmussen. She spoke about it in words that were collected into the kind of carefully constructed admission that a person makes when when they have spent years calculating exactly how much accountability is necessary to satisfy a parole board while minimizing the legal and reputational implications of a full, unvarnished confession. She said the words, she acknowledged the act, but she framed the killing as something closer to a fight that got out of hand than a premeditated execution. She said she had gone to the condominium that morning not intending to kill, but to confront. She said things had escalated. She said she was sorry. The people who had spent decades working this case, and the family who had spent those same decades without Sherry, did not find this convincing. Greg Stearns, a retired LAPD detective who had worked the reinvestigation, testified at the parole hearing with a directness that left no room for the version of events Lazarus was offering. Stephanie Lazarus, he said, had stalked her victim. She had chosen a time and a place when she knew Sherry would be home and alone. She had brought cordage, rope, to the condominium with her. She had used an improvised silencer to muffle the gunshots. She had staged the scene afterward to look like a burglary. She had taken the car. None of these details are consistent with a spontaneous confrontation gone wrong. All of them speak to planning, to deliberateness, to a crime that was thought about in advance and executed with awareness. The family was outraged by the parole board's finding of suitability. Connie Rasmussen, Sherry's sister, gave voice to what the family felt with clarity and force. She spoke about her sister, not as a case or a victim or a name attached to a legal file, but as a person, as a nurse who had dedicated her life to caring for others, as a woman who had been murdered in her own home by someone consumed by jealousy and obsession, as a sister who had been taken from her and from their parents at 29 years old, leaving behind an absence that never filled. John Rutan, who had spent decades trying to process his own complicated position at the center of this tragedy, also spoke. He made clear that he did not believe Lazarus's professions of remorse were genuine. He said that she had evaded justice for 23 years. She had lied about what she had done throughout her entire trial. She had pursued parole for years before finally acknowledging the crime, and even then only in the context of a hearing where her continued imprisonment was at stake. He described the crime as skillful deception and complete disregard for the suffering of others, not an impulsive act. California Governor Gavin Newsom intervened, expressing serious concerns about the parole decision. He acknowledged that Lazarus had a good prison record, but noted pointedly that she had evaded justice for more than 2 decades and had not appeared to begin taking full accountability for the murder until she was finally caught, meaning that her accountability was driven by circumstance, not by conscience. The parole board went back into session. They reviewed the decision. They considered the testimony, the family's objections, the governor's concerns, and the full body of evidence about the nature of the crime and Lazarus's conduct before, during, and after it. The lead investigator's testimony about the staging, the cordage, the silencer, the deliberateness of every step Lazarus had taken, including the 23-year concealment of what she had done, was weighed against the claims of rehabilitation and remorse. The parole was rescinded. A second parole hearing was held in 2025. The parole board again found Lazarus unsuitable for release, determining that her testimony about the events of 1986 did not match the physical evidence from the crime scene. The commissioner noted that if the killing had been a mutual fight, as Lazarus claimed, there would have been more of her own DNA at the scene, but there was not. She was the one engaging in the extreme act of violence, unilaterally, against a woman who was fighting for her life. Stephanie Lazarus remains in prison, and Sherry Rasmussen, who was 37 years gone before her killer's name was ever officially spoken in a courtroom, continues to be remembered by the people who loved her, by her sister, who shows up at every hearing and speaks her name, by her mother, who carried the grief of losing her for decades and who had to process both the horror of the truth and the validation of finally being believed, by the colleagues she trained and the patients she cared for and the hundreds of people whose lives she touched in her 29 years on this earth. But before we reach the final reckoning, before we sit with the full weight of what justice meant and what it cost and what it still cannot give back, it is worth taking the time to understand something about this case that goes beyond the biography of Sherry Rasmussen and the crimes of Stephanie Lazarus. Because the story of this case is not just the story of one murder and one murderer. It is the story of a system and what happens to ordinary people when that system fails them. It is the story of what happens when a father walks into a police station and tells investigators the truth and is not believed. It is the story of what happens when a department closes ranks around itself, when the institutional pressure to protect the blue line, even when no one is consciously aware that it is happening, bends the investigation away from the uncomfortable truth and toward the comfortable fiction. It is the story of what happens when a woman carries a badge and uses everything that badge teaches her to escape the consequences of what she has done. And it is the story of what happens when science advances faster than human failings, when DNA, patient, persistent, immune to politics and prejudice and institutional inertia, holds onto a truth that human beings let slip away for 23 years and brings it back into the light. Because the truth does not disappear. It waits. It waited in an evidence envelope in an LAPD storage facility for more than a decade. It waited in the cells of Stephanie Lazarus's biological material, microscopic and indifferent to human deception. It waited in the hearts of a family that refused to stop asking the question. And eventually, it came. To fully understand the Sherry Rasmussen case, to hold it in your hands and feel the full weight of everything it represents, it is necessary to spend some time with the woman at the center of it. Not the murder, not the investigation, not the courtroom drama of the trial or the years of parole hearings. The woman, Sherry Rasmussen herself. Because one of the most troubling things about true crime as a genre, as a way of engaging with real human tragedy, is the ease with which the victim becomes secondary, becomes a body, a crime scene, a catalyst for a drama that is really about the killer or the investigation or the failure of institutions. Sherry Rasmussen was none of those things. She was a person, and it matters that we know who she was. She was born on February 7, 1957, in Loma Linda, California, the second of two daughters. Her parents, Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, raised her in a household shaped by the values of their Seventh-day Adventist faith: health, service, community, compassion. These were not abstract principles for the Rasmussen family. They were lived values, the organizing principles of a life. And in Sherry, those values took root and grew into something remarkable. From the time she was a young girl, Sherry was drawn to the idea of caring for other people. Not in the generic, unfocused way that children sometimes express. The vague, I want to help people, that does not yet know what form it will take, but with a specificity and seriousness that spoke to something genuinely deep in her character. She was interested in medicine, in bodies and how they work, in the process of healing, in the profound human act of being present with someone in their pain and doing something useful about it. She chose nursing, and she did not choose it the way someone chooses a career path that seems practical or that offers good job security. She chose it the way you choose something when it is the truest expression of who you are. Nursing, for Sherry, was not a job. It was a vocation in the oldest and most serious sense of the word, a calling that shaped everything she did and how she did it. At Loma Linda University, she earned her nursing degree with the kind of academic and professional distinction that her professors found remarkable. She understood the technical complexity of critical care with the analytical precision of an engineer, but she also understood the human element, the fear, the uncertainty, the need for connection, with an emotional intelligence that could not be taught in a classroom. She had both halves of what the best nurses possess, the knowledge and the heart. The positions she went on to hold would have been impressive for a nurse at any age. At UCLA, she became head nurse of the coronary care and observation unit, a high-pressure, high-stakes environment where the patients in the beds were people whose hearts were failing them, where the margins for error were thin and the demands on the nursing staff were intense. She ran that unit with capability and compassion, earning the respect of the physicians and the gratitude of her patients and their families. She was also appointed an unpaid assistant clinical professor of nursing at UCLA, teaching classes, giving lectures, helping to shape the next generation of nurses who would go on to care for patients in hospitals and clinics and emergency rooms across Southern California and beyond. She did this not for money. The position was unpaid, but because she believed in the work, because she understood that the knowledge she had accumulated was worth passing on, because she was, at her core, a teacher as well as a healer. And by her late 20s, by the time she was in her final year of life, living in the Van Nuys condominium with the man she had married and the future she was building, Sherry Rasmussen was the director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center, 29 years old and running the nursing department of a major hospital, responsible for the quality of care that dozens and dozens of patients received every single day, setting standards, making decisions, guiding a staff of nurses through the demands of a busy medical facility. The people who worked with Sherry at Glendale Adventist spoke about her in terms that go beyond professional respect. They remembered her warmth, her specific, individual kindness, the way she noticed people, the way she made the people around her feel seen and valued. They remembered her integrity, the way she held herself to the same standards she set for others, the way she was never asking of her staff what she was not prepared to do herself. And they remembered the atmosphere she created on her unit, the sense that the work mattered, that the patients in those beds were people whose dignity and comfort and care were the central purpose of everything they were doing. That was Sherry Rasmussen's gift, the ability to make the people around her understand, not just intellectually but in their bones, why the work they were doing was worth doing. She had been at Glendale Adventist for less than a year when she was killed. If there is a particular cruelty in the timing of Sherry's death, and there is tremendous cruelty in it. It lies not just in the 3 months of marriage cut short, but in the trajectory that was cut short along with it. Sherry Rasmussen at 29 was not finished. She was just beginning. The career that had already reached such extraordinary heights was still ascending. The life that she and John were building together in that Van Nuys condominium was still being built. The children they may have talked about having were still theoretical, still potential, still possible. None of it happened, because someone decided it would not. It is important to also understand something about the way Sherry handled the situation with Stephanie Lazarus in the months before her death. She knew something was wrong. She could feel it. The woman who had been in a relationship with John, or who believed herself to have been in a relationship with John, was not letting go. The confrontation at the hospital was not a small thing. It was frightening. It was the kind of confrontation that a reasonable person walks away from shaken, aware that the situation is not stable, aware that the other person's emotional state is not manageable by ordinary social means. And yet Sherry did not escalate. She did not go to the police. She did not demand that John intervene with ultimatums or legal threats. She tried to handle the situation with the same quiet, calm, practical competence that she brought to everything else in her life. She told her family what was happening. She talked to people she trusted. She was aware and careful and did not dismiss the situation, but she also did not, perhaps could not have anticipated, as many of us could not, that the level of danger she was in was not the danger of a persistent harassment situation, but the danger of something far more extreme. She was 29 years old. She had been married for 3 months. She was at the beginning of the greatest chapter of her life. She deserved more time. That truth, simple, devastating, and absolutely final, is the foundation underneath everything else about this case. Before the DNA and the cold case unit and the surveillance operation and the interrogation and the conviction, there is Sherry Rasmussen, a young woman full of competence and compassion and love, killed in her own home because someone else's obsession would not release its grip. She is the reason this case matters. Not the killer, not the failure of the investigation, not the legal drama of the trial or the parole hearings. Sherry, her life, and what was taken from it. Her family has made sure of that, in the decades since her death. They have never allowed Sherry to be reduced to a footnote in her own story. Connie Rasmussen, her sister, has stood in courtrooms and hearing rooms and spoken Sherry's name with the clarity of someone who refuses to let the world forget that a real person died. Loretta Rasmussen, their mother, carried that grief through years and years of silence and uncertainty and fought alongside her husband to be heard by a department that was not listening. These women, the women who loved Sherry and who were left to live without her, are part of the story too. Their persistence is part of why the truth eventually came out. But Sherry comes first. She always comes first. She was the nurse who called her patients by name and remembered what mattered to them. She was the director who led by example. She was the daughter who called her parents and made them feel that the world was going to be all right. She was the newlywed who looked at her husband on their wedding day with a smile that contained everything she hoped for. She was Sherry Rasmussen, and she was 29 years old, and she deserved every year she did not get. There is something almost unbearable about examining the failures of the 1986 investigation now that the truth is known. Looking back through the lens of what we know, knowing the name, knowing the motive, knowing the physical evidence that was collected and stored and never properly followed up on. The path that should have been taken in those early weeks is so clear and so obvious that the path that was actually taken feels not just like an error, but like an injustice in its own right. This is not about vilifying the individual detectives who worked the case in 1986. It is about understanding the systemic problems that their handling of the case revealed, and that the subsequent years of the investigation made impossible to ignore. The first and most consequential failure was the narrative lock-in that happened almost immediately after Sherry's body was found. When investigators arrived at that condominium and saw the staged burglary scene, they built a story around the visible evidence without adequately testing that story against the evidence that did not fit it. The bite mark, for instance. The nature of the violence, the sustained, personal, intimate brutality of it. The fact that the stereo equipment, which an escaping burglar would have taken, was left behind and merely stacked near the door. These were all details that, taken together, pointed away from the burglary narrative. They were not adequately weighed. The second failure was the handling of Nels Rasmussen's information. When Sherry's father walked into a police station and told investigators about the woman, John's former girlfriend, the police officer, that information should have been treated as a significant lead. It should have been documented formally, assigned to an investigator, and followed up on with the seriousness it deserved. Instead, it was noted informally at best and effectively ignored at worst. There is a troubling dimension to this specific failure that deserves attention. When Nels Rasmussen pointed toward a police officer as a possible suspect, the institutional response of the LAPD was to continue looking for civilian male burglars. It is impossible to know with certainty whether the fact that the person being pointed to was a fellow officer influenced the department's decision not to pursue that lead. The culture of law enforcement, the deep, powerful, unspoken loyalty that binds officers to one another, is not something that evaporates in the face of a grieving father's accusation. The possibility that blue loyalty, even unconscious and unacknowledged, shaped the direction of the early investigation is one that the case's subsequent history makes difficult to dismiss. This is made more disturbing by the later evidence suggesting that files in the Rasmussen case may have been tampered with during the years following the murder. Lazarus, as a serving LAPD officer, would have had access to departmental files. Whether she ever accessed the Rasmussen case file during the years when she was actively employed by the department that was theoretically investigating her crime is not something that was definitively proven. But the suggestion, the possibility, is a dark and chilling one. It speaks to the particular danger of a killer who is also a cop. A killer who knows the system from the inside. A killer who knows what investigators look for, what evidence matters, what needs to disappear to make a case go away. Sherry's family sued the LAPD over these failures. The lawsuit was ultimately unsuccessful, but the act of bringing it, of formally putting on record the family's belief that the department's handling of the case represented a failure for which responsibility should be acknowledged, was an act of refusing to let the institution off the hook. The family understood that the decades of silence were not entirely the result of innocent investigative error. Some of what happened in that case file, before and after the initial investigation, deserved to be accounted for. The criminalist who eventually extracted the key DNA evidence from the bite mark swab, the technician who did the delicate, critical work of recovering that profile from material that had been stored for nearly 2 decades, also paid a price for her role in this case. She filed a lawsuit claiming that she had been pressured by police to favor certain suspects in the Rasmussen case and in other high-profile investigations, and that she had faced retaliation for raising concerns about that pressure. The lawsuit was ultimately unsuccessful, but its existence adds another texture to the picture of an institution that was not always comfortable with where the evidence was pointing. None of this diminishes the work of the detectives who eventually solved the case. Jim Nuttall, who picked up the file in 2009 and followed it to its conclusion, and the investigators who worked alongside him, did their jobs with integrity and courage. It takes a particular kind of professional courage to pursue a fellow officer, to look past the blue bond and follow the evidence to a colleague, and the team that brought Lazarus to justice deserves full credit for doing exactly that. But it also matters to acknowledge the full truth of what happened before they got there. 23 years of a family waiting. 23 years of a killer working in the same building as the people investigating her crime. 23 years of a bite mark swab sitting in an evidence room with the answer sealed inside it. Waiting for the moment when someone would finally do what should have been done much sooner. The failures of the original investigation are not ancient history. They are not the kind of mistakes that are safely confined to a particular era, or a particular city, or a particular police department. They are recognizable patterns, narrative lock-in, selective hearing, institutional loyalty that outweighs institutional accountability, that recur in police investigations across the country and across the world. Understanding them in the specific context of the Rasmussen case is a way of understanding them in general, of seeing how they operate and what damage they do. And there is one more layer to this story that deserves examination before we move into the final stages of what happened in that courtroom and in the years that followed. The question of John Ruetten. John Ruetten is a complicated figure in this narrative, and complexity deserves honesty. He is, first and foremost, a victim. He married a woman he loved, and came home 3 months later to find her dead. He has lived with the particular, devastating guilt of a man who knows that the person who killed his wife did so because of him, because of a relationship he had maintained, because of choices he made about how to handle that relationship and what obligations he owed to the people in it. That is a weight that no one should have to carry. He is also the man who acknowledged, in testimony at Lazarus's trial, that he had slept with Lazarus after becoming engaged to Sherry. This detail is not raised to condemn him. What he did within his own complicated personal life before his marriage is his business, not anyone else's. But it is raised because it is part of understanding the full picture of the situation Lazarus was operating in and the signals she may have received about whether John Ruetten had truly made his choice. He is also the man who told investigators, in those early days of 1986, that Lazarus's name should be looked at, and whose communication of that information apparently went nowhere. He told Nuttall in 2009 that he had given the name years before and that it had never been documented. Whether that failure was entirely on the part of the investigators, or whether there was some ambiguity in how he communicated the information, is something that has been impossible to determine definitively. What is clear is that John Ruetten, whatever his own complicities and failures and wounds, showed up at the parole hearings in the years after Lazarus's conviction and spoke on behalf of Sherry. He spoke about what was taken. He said clearly that Lazarus had hidden the truth for 23 years and had only begun to acknowledge it when her own freedom was at stake. He stood with the family of the woman he had loved and lost and said, in essence, she does not deserve to be free. That too is part of the record. Let us go back to the beginning one more time. Not to the crime, though the crime is always there, underneath everything, the terrible foundation on which everything else is built. But to the moment when the two women at the center of this story first appeared in the orbit of the same man. Because understanding how this situation developed, how a casual college relationship on the UCLA campus in the late 1970s eventually became the motive for a murder in 1986, requires understanding something about the nature of obsession and what it does to a person's perception of reality. John Ruetten and Stephanie Lazarus met in the dormitories at UCLA in the late 1970s. They were both young, both ambitious, both in the early stages of lives that seemed full of possibility. Ruetten was studying mechanical engineering, working toward a career in the tech industry that was just beginning to take shape in Southern California. Lazarus was studying political science and sociology, though her eventual path would take her in a very different direction. By Ruetten's own accounting, the accounting he gave in testimony at Lazarus's trial, the connection between them was physical without being emotionally serious on his side. They were occasional, informal. He did not think of her as his girlfriend. He did not feel that there was a commitment, an exclusivity, a claim being laid or received. This was, in his experience of it, the kind of casual connection that happens between young people in close quarters, nothing that would need to be formally ended because it had never been formally begun. For Lazarus, the experience appears to have been entirely different. In the psychology of obsession, and this is important to understand because it helps explain what would eventually happen, There is a particular kind of distortion that can occur when one person's emotional investment in a relationship vastly exceeds the other person's. The person with the greater investment begins to assign meaning to encounters and connections that the other person experiences as neutral or limited. Small gestures become significant. Continued physical contact, even when infrequent and never accompanied by verbal commitment, becomes evidence, in the mind of the more invested party, of a relationship that the other party does not recognize as existing. Lazarus's behavior in the years between her graduation from the LAPD Academy in 1983 and Sherry's murder in 1986 follows this pattern with uncomfortable clarity. Rutan had moved on, not dramatically, not cruelly, but he had found in Sherry Rasmussen something that he had not found with Lazarus. A genuine, reciprocal, committed love. When he met Sherry at that party in June of 1984, something clicked that had not clicked before, and his attention and his emotional investment moved in Sherry's direction with the naturalness of someone discovering what they had been looking for. Lazarus did not accept this. Whether she could not accept it or would not is a distinction that, from the outside, is nearly impossible to draw. But the evidence of her behavior, the persistent contact, the attempts to maintain connection with Rutan, the confrontation at Sherry's hospital, the fact that Rutan had been intimate with her even after becoming engaged, suggests someone who was, on some fundamental level, unable to integrate the reality that she had been displaced, unable to absorb the information that the person she had attached to had made a different choice. The announcement of the engagement, the wedding in November of 1985, the legally formalized, publicly witnessed, celebration-surrounded confirmation that John Rutan had chosen someone else, had committed to someone else, was going to spend his life with someone else. Whatever final wall that erected in Lazarus's mind, whether it was the wall that locked her in or the wall that she decided she could not live behind, it seems to have been the thing that pushed her from obsession into action. 3 months after the wedding. 3 months. That is the window between the moment Sherry Rasmussen became John Rutan's wife and the morning when Lazarus came to the door of the Van Nuys condominium. At the 2023 parole hearing, Lazarus spoke about what she said she remembered from that morning. She said she had gone to the condominium intending to confront Sherry. She said things had escalated. She said she had not planned to kill anyone. The investigation, the physical evidence, and the lead detective's testimony say otherwise. They say the planning was there from the beginning. The choice of time and place, the cordage, the improvised silencer, the stage scene afterward. They say this was not an uncontrolled eruption, but a calculated act. But even setting aside the question of premeditation, even if we entertain, for a moment, the version of events that Lazarus has offered, what happened in that apartment that morning was still a choice. At every stage of what occurred, Lazarus had the option to stop. She could have not gone to the apartment. She could have left when it became clear that the confrontation was escalating. She could have put down the gun. She could have called for help when Sherry was injured. She chose, at each of those moments, to continue. And the woman who had dedicated her professional life to protecting people from exactly this kind of violence, who had sworn an oath to serve and protect, made all of those choices with full knowledge of what she was doing. That is what makes the crime of Stephanie Lazarus distinctively terrible, beyond the ordinary horror of murder. Not just that she killed someone. Not just that the person she killed was innocent, was young, was newly married, was full of purpose and potential, but that she was a police officer. That she had looked at the worst of what human beings do to one another and had chosen, professionally and vocally, to be on the side of the victims. And then she became the perpetrator. And then she put the badge back on. And then she went to work. The interrogation video from the June 2009 interview with Lazarus, the video that was eventually made public and that has been analyzed and dissected by journalists and legal experts and true crime researchers, is one of the most chilling documents in the entire case. Not because Lazarus is screaming or violent or menacing. She is none of those things. She is composed. She is careful. She is the embodiment of someone who knows exactly how this game is played because she has played it from the other side 100 times. You can watch her process each question before she answers it. You can see the pauses, the fractional, controlled pauses that precede her responses, the careful weighing of what to say and how to say it. You can see the moment when the nature of the conversation shifts and she registers the shift and responds to it. You can see the transition from seemingly relaxed conversation to the controlled stillness of someone who is now actively managing their exposure. She was a detective. She knew exactly what was happening. And even so, knowing that, she stayed composed. She did not panic. She did not collapse. She controlled her exit from the situation by invoking her legal rights at precisely the right moment. The composure itself is the most damning thing, because it speaks to 23 years of practice. 23 years of living with what she knew she had done and presenting a different face to the world. 23 years of going to work every day and performing the role of law-abiding officer while carrying the knowledge of what she had done to Sherry Rasmussen. That kind of sustained deception, maintained over that length of time, with that level of consistency, is not something most human beings are capable of. It requires a particular kind of internal architecture, a way of partitioning the self so that the part that knows the truth is sealed off from the part that faces the world. Whether that constitutes a kind of pathology, a deeper psychological disturbance that goes beyond simple guilt and concealment, is something that is beyond the scope of this story to diagnose. But it is impossible to look at what Lazarus sustained for 23 years, the professional performance, the collegial relationships, the ordinary daily life maintained on top of the knowledge of what she had done, and not feel something shift in your understanding of what some human beings are capable of. The full truth, the complete truth, the version of events that would address every question, fill every gap, account for every inconsistency, is something that Lazarus has never fully offered. Even the confession she gave at the 2023 parole hearing was a partial one, shaped by the legal and strategic context in which it was delivered. What she actually thought that morning when she drove to Van Nuys. What she told herself in the hours and days immediately after the murder. What went through her mind the first time she walked back into the LAPD headquarters wearing her uniform. What it felt like to sit in a briefing about an unsolved homicide case that she herself had committed. Those are the questions that will never be fully answered. But the questions that can be answered, who killed Sherry Rasmussen, why, and how they were caught, those have been answered. The science answered them. The investigation answered them. The jury answered them. And the verdict that was delivered in March of 2012 put those answers on the permanent, public, irrefutable record. The trial of Stephanie Lazarus was, from the very first day of opening arguments, a legal proceeding of unusual intensity. This was not simply a murder trial, though the charge of first-degree murder was, of course, at its center. It was also a reckoning with a set of questions about institutions and identity and the use and abuse of authority that made it feel larger than the specific circumstances of a single crime committed in a Van Nuys condominium in 1986. The courtroom was packed. The press coverage was extensive. And the jury that sat in the box and listened to weeks of testimony was being asked to do something that required them to navigate their own preconceptions about police officers, about evidence, about what it means for a person to be capable of an act that seems incompatible with the identity they have spent a career constructing. The prosecution went first, and the story they laid before the jury was a careful, chronological, methodically constructed account of everything that is described in these pages. The relationship between Lazarus and Rutan, the emergence of Sherry into that picture, the confrontations, the escalating obsession, the marriage that appears to have been the final provocation, and the crime itself. They walked through the crime scene evidence with forensic specificity. They explained the DNA testing process, how the bite mark swab had been collected in 1986, how it had been analyzed in 2004, how the profile had been generated and stored, and how the sample collected from Lazarus's discarded drink straw in 2009 had matched that profile with a precision that left no scientific room for doubt. Expert witnesses testified about DNA analysis in terms that were both technically rigorous and accessible to a lay jury. They explained what the match meant statistically. The probability that any other individual on Earth shared the exact genetic profile found on that evidence was essentially zero. The science was presented not as a magic trick or a mystery, but as a disciplined, reproducible, evidence-based process with established protocols and documented chain of custody. Every challenge the defense would raise had already been anticipated and addressed. The defense strategy, as expected, focused heavily on the DNA evidence and its vulnerabilities. The attorneys pointed to the age of the original sample, nearly 25 years old at the time of analysis. and argued that degradation, contamination, and the imperfections inherent in the storage conditions could have compromised the results. It was a technically sophisticated challenge, and it deserved to be taken seriously. The defense was doing its job, testing the evidence, probing its weaknesses, ensuring that the prosecution was held to the standard of proof that the legal system requires. But the prosecution's forensic experts were prepared for this line of attack, and their responses were detailed and confident. The degradation of the sample had been accounted for in the analysis. The protocols had been followed. The chain of custody had been documented at every stage. The match was what the match was. Beyond the DNA, the prosecution built the case through the testimony of witnesses who could speak to the relationships and the timeline and the physical evidence in its full human context. Colleagues of Sherry from Glendale Adventist testified about the confrontation with the woman who had come to the hospital, about the description of the encounter, about how Sherry had described her discomfort, about the atmosphere of unease that surrounded the situation. People who had known Rutan and Lazarus during the UCLA years testified about the nature of their connection and about Lazarus's behavior in the period after Rutan's relationship with Sherry began. The gun was addressed. The caliber match, the timing of the reported theft, the absence of a recovered weapon. All of this was woven into the narrative the prosecution was constructing. It could not be proven with the certainty of the DNA match, but it contributed to the overall picture. The profile of a calculated, premeditated crime. The profile of a person who used her professional knowledge to cover her tracks and deflect suspicion. The stereo equipment. The staging. The pillow used as a silencer. The car taken from the parking lot. Each element of the staged burglary scene was examined and explained as evidence of post-crime deliberateness, of a person who had not killed in a panic but who had stayed composed enough to arrange the scene before leaving. The very composure that the defense might have hoped to invoke as evidence of innocence, the ability to maintain a normal life after the crime, to never be flagged by colleagues or supervisors, was reframed by the prosecution as evidence of the cold calculation at the heart of the crime itself. The lead investigator on the reinvestigation, Greg Stearns, was among the most powerful witnesses the prosecution called. Stearns, who was retired by the time of the trial, but who had led the team that brought Lazarus in, testified with the authority of someone who had spent years understanding every detail of this case. He spoke about the physical evidence. He spoke about what the staging of the scene told investigators about the mindset of the killer. He spoke about the significance of the DNA match and what it had meant for the direction of the investigation. And he spoke about the decision to conduct the covert surveillance operation, the judgment call that had been made to follow Lazarus and retrieve her discarded DNA without alerting her that she was a suspect. He was unequivocal. What had happened in that condominium on February 24, 1986, was not a confrontation gone wrong. It was a premeditated murder, planned and executed by someone who knew what they were doing and who used their knowledge of law enforcement to maximize their chances of never being caught. Lazarus did not take the stand. This was a strategic decision by her defense team, protecting her from cross-examination, protecting the case from the damage that her own words under pressure might do. It was the right decision from a purely tactical standpoint. Her statements in the interrogation video were already in evidence. There was nothing to be gained by putting her in front of the prosecution. But the jury had eyes. They could see Stephanie Lazarus sitting at the defense table, composed, attentive, professional. They could see the woman who had been a detective, who had spent a quarter-century in law enforcement, who was now accused of a crime that seemed, on the surface, incompatible with everything that career represented. And they listened to the evidence. All of it. The full, detailed, carefully presented body of evidence that the prosecution had spent years assembling. The jury deliberated. And on March 8, 2012, they returned their verdict. Guilty. First-degree murder. There is a particular sound that a courtroom makes when a verdict like that is read. A collective exhalation. A release of breath that has been held for hours and days, and, in this case, for 26 years. The family of Sherry Rasmussen, sitting in that courtroom, heard the word they had been waiting for longer than many of the jurors had been old enough to drive. Guilty. It is not a satisfying word, exactly. It does not repair anything. But it is the word that the law has for its most solemn reckoning. And hearing it spoken in that room, in that official and final context, was the end of one part of a journey that should never have been as long as it was. Lazarus showed almost no visible reaction when the verdict was read. She had spent 26 years showing the world the face she wanted it to see. She was not going to let it slip now. She was sentenced, shortly afterward, to 27 years to life in prison. She was taken into custody and transported to the California Institution for Women in Chino, a correctional facility southeast of Los Angeles. Her LAPD badge and her detective's credentials became items of historical record, filed alongside the case documentation of a career that had ended in the most devastating possible way. The Rasmussen family held each other in that courtroom after the verdict. Sherry's sister Connie, who had been fighting alongside her parents for longer than should have been necessary, allowed herself to feel the weight of what had just happened. Not relief, exactly. Not closure, in the way people use that word as though grief has an off switch. But something. An acknowledgement. A recognition that the world had finally, officially, said the truth out loud. Sherry Rasmussen was murdered. The person who murdered her is being held accountable. That should have been said in 1986. But it was said in 2012. And it was said. The decade that followed Stephanie Lazarus's conviction was, in many ways, the decade of its aftermath. The long, complicated, contested period in which the verdict became the beginning of a new set of legal and emotional battles rather than the end of the old ones. This is not unusual in cases of this magnitude. A first-degree murder conviction with a sentence of 27 years to life does not mean the legal history of the case is finished. It means it has entered a new phase. Lazarus began serving her sentence at the California Institution for Women. By the accounts of those who track her progress within the correctional system, she adapted to prison life with the same controlled competence she had brought to everything else. She was not a troublemaker. She did not rack up disciplinary infractions. She found ways to be useful and productive within the institution's structure, establishing the textbook nonprofit, mentoring younger inmates, maintaining the kind of record that parole boards are designed, in part, to respond to. The question of parole first arose seriously in the context of California Senate Bill 260, signed into law in 2013, which mandated that people who had committed their crimes when they were under 18 receive youth offender parole hearings. A subsequent law expanded this principle to cover offenders who were under 23 at the time of their crime. And then, in 2018, Senate Bill 1391 further extended the framework to those who were under 26, bringing Lazarus, who had been 25 at the time of the murder, within the scope of the law. The family and the investigators who testified at the hearing said they did not believe her. Not because human beings cannot change, they can, and the law is built on that premise. But because the specific content and timing and context of her admission suggested that what had changed was her circumstances, not her character. She had evaded capture for 23 years, maintained her innocence through the entire trial, and only began the process of acknowledging what she had done when she needed the parole board to see her as someone who had taken responsibility for her actions. That is not responsibility. That is tactics. Governor Gavin Newsom, in his letter expressing concern about the initial parole decision, put the point cleanly. She had not appeared to begin taking full accountability for the murder until she was finally caught. The implication was clear. The accountability was instrumental, not moral. It was the accountability of someone calculating the minimum required for a desired outcome, not the accountability of someone genuinely reckoning with the harm they had caused. The parole was rescinded. Lazarus remained in prison. A second hearing followed in 2025. The parole board, at that hearing, found her unsuitable for release again. The commissioner noted that Lazarus's own version of events, her account of a confrontation that got out of hand, did not match the physical evidence. If the killing had been a mutual struggle, there would have been more biological evidence from Lazarus at the scene. The evidence showed that the violence had been one-directional, Lazarus inflicting it, Sherry fighting desperately to survive it. For the Rasmussen family, each of these hearings is its own ordeal. The system that requires them to show up, to tell their story again, to make the case again that their daughter and sister and friend deserves more weight in the calculation than the parole eligibility of the person who killed her. That system asks a great deal of people who have already given more than enough. Connie Rasmussen has spoken with heartbreaking clarity about what it is like to have to relive the facts of her sister's murder in a formal hearing room every few years, to have to argue against the release of the person who committed it, to have to make the case that justice still matters when the world has largely moved on. She does it because Sherry cannot do it herself. That is the final, irreducible truth that underlies everything about the ongoing legal battles. Sherry Rasmussen cannot speak. She cannot show up at the parole hearing and tell the board who she was and what was taken from her and why the person who took it should not be free. She was 29 years old when she was silenced. Her family has been speaking for her ever since. And the least the world can do, the absolute minimum, is to listen. There are questions that cases like this one leave behind in the air. Questions that do not have simple answers, that resist the impulse to wrap everything in a clean resolution. They hang there, persistent, asking to be engaged with honestly rather than bypassed in the rush toward closure. One of the most important of those questions is this: how do we understand the institutional failure of the Los Angeles Police Department in the Rasmussen case? And what does that failure tell us about the broader relationship between law enforcement and the communities it is meant to serve? The LAPD in 1986 was a department under significant internal pressure. The aftermath of the Hollywood burglars scandal, in which 14 officers had been fired following prosecutions for burglary, had damaged morale and created a climate of internal tension. Chief Daryl Gates, who was overseeing the department during that period, ran an organization that was, by most accounts, intensely focused on its own culture and identity. The Blue Wall, the informal, powerful code that says officers protect each other, that internal problems are handled internally, that the outside world does not get to define who the LAPD is or what it does, was a living reality in that department in 1986. Whether that culture directly contributed to the failure to properly investigate Stephanie Lazarus as a suspect in Sherry Rasmussen's murder is something that cannot be definitively proven. What can be said is that when Nels Rasmussen pointed investigators toward a fellow officer, the investigation did not follow that lead. What can be said is that the information he provided was apparently never formally documented in any way that made it retrievable or actionable. What can be said is that a female cop, in a department where women on the force were still a relatively recent and not always welcomed phenomenon, may have benefited from a double invisibility. First, the invisibility of the institutional loyalty that protects all officers, and second, the invisibility of being a woman in a situation where the prevailing assumption was that the perpetrators were male. The criminalist who found the key DNA evidence and later claimed she had been pressured about her findings adds yet another disturbing thread to this institutional picture. If there was, in any part of the departmental culture, a willingness to shade the direction of evidence analysis toward preferred conclusions, if the science was not allowed to simply be what it was, independent of what investigators wanted to hear, then the DNA evidence that eventually broke the case open was not just delayed by the limitations of the technology. It was potentially suppressed by the limitations of the institution. The Rasmussen family's lawsuit against the LAPD, though ultimately unsuccessful, was a direct confrontation with that institutional failure. They were saying, in the formal language of the legal system, that the department owed them an accounting. That the failures of the investigation were not simply bad luck or the reasonable errors of investigators working with imperfect information, but reflected something more systemic, something that required acknowledgement and response. The lawsuit did not succeed, but the act of bringing it, of standing up in a court of law and saying, officially, that the institution had failed, and that that failure had consequences, and that those consequences deserved to be recognized, was itself a form of accountability. It was the family refusing to allow the narrative of institutional imperfection to be quietly absorbed and forgotten. It was Nels and Loretta Rasmussen saying that what happened to them mattered, that the way the investigation of their daughter's murder was handled was not acceptable, that the people who failed her should not simply be allowed to move on. For people who care about the fairness and accountability of public institutions, and this is a story that speaks directly to that concern, the LAPD's handling of the Rasmussen case is a cautionary example of what happens when institutions are not designed to be genuinely self-critical. When the culture of loyalty overrides the culture of truth. When the investigation is shaped by what the investigators want to find rather than by where the evidence leads. These are not problems unique to the LAPD. They are problems that exist, in varying degrees, in law enforcement agencies across the country. The recognition of those problems, the willingness to name them, to examine them, to design systems and practices that counteract them, is an ongoing project in American policing. The Rasmussen case is one of the most dramatic examples of what those problems look like when they are allowed to run unchecked for decades. There is also a broader social question embedded in this case, a question about women, and about the specific kinds of danger that women face from other women who have become consumed by obsession and jealousy. This dimension of the story tends to be underemphasized, possibly because the image of violent jealousy is more culturally familiar in a male context. We have well-worn narratives about the jealous ex-boyfriend who cannot let go, about the danger that men pose to women who reject them. But the Rasmussen case illustrates that this dynamic is not exclusive to gender, that a woman consumed by obsession, by the conviction that she has been wronged by the displacement of someone she loved, can be just as dangerous as a man in the same emotional state. Sherry Rasmussen was killed by another woman. She was killed by someone who, on the surface, shared the social category of the professional woman navigating a demanding field. Though Lazarus was in law enforcement and Sherry was in healthcare, both were women who had chosen demanding, service-oriented careers and who had built their professional identities around those choices. But beneath the surface of shared social identity was something completely different. Lazarus was, in relation to Sherry, not a colleague or a peer but a predator. Someone who had fixed a specific destructive intention on a specific human target and who had pursued that intention through a sustained, deliberate, lethal act. The danger was invisible to Sherry until it was too late. The woman who came to the hospital was troubling and uncomfortable, but she did not carry the visible markers that people are trained to associate with physical threat. She was a professional. She was, in her external presentation, a person going through the ordinary distress of an ended relationship. The institutional authority she carried, the badge, the uniform, the professional identity of a police officer, would have made the idea that she was genuinely dangerous harder, not easier, to fully absorb. This invisibility, the way the danger was hidden behind a professional identity, behind gender expectations, behind the assumption that a police officer is by definition on the right side, is one of the most important lessons in this case. And it is a lesson that has particular resonance for women who are navigating situations in their own lives that feel wrong, that carry that particular unease, that make the back of the neck prickle in ways that reason cannot fully explain. When something feels dangerous, it deserves to be taken seriously, even when the source of the danger is not who you would expect, even when the person making you uncomfortable is a professional or an authority figure or someone who carries the social markers of safety and normalcy. Even then, Sherry tried to handle it quietly. Sherry tried to de-escalate. Sherry did not want to make trouble. These are the behaviors that women are socialized toward in situations of conflict, and they are behaviors that, in certain specific and terrible circumstances, cost women their lives. When a case like this one sits in the public consciousness for a long time, when it is written about and televised and covered by documentaries and true crime podcasts and investigative journalism, it tends to accumulate layers of meaning and interpretation that go beyond the specific facts. The Sherry Rasmussen case has been covered extensively by Dateline NBC, by Oxygen's Real Murders of Los Angeles, by Matthew McGough's comprehensive book The Lazarus Files, by ABC's 2020, by numerous podcasts and written investigations. Each of these treatments has illuminated different aspects of the story. Taken together, they have given the case a cultural weight and resonance that extends far beyond Los Angeles. Matthew McGough's book deserves particular mention because it is the most thorough and comprehensive account of the case that exists in print. McGough spent years researching and reporting the story, going through tens of thousands of pages of investigative documents, interviewing witnesses and investigators and family members, and piecing together a narrative that is both deeply reported and genuinely literary. The book is called The Lazarus Files, a title that carries multiple meanings, the obvious reference to Stephanie Lazarus, but also the idea of something coming back to life, a case that seemed dead being resurrected by the persistence of science and the determination of investigators. In one particularly striking passage about the case, McGough reflected on a question that sits at the heart of the entire story: whether Lazarus actually intended to kill Sherry when she went to the Van Nuys condominium that morning, or whether the murder was, in some sense, the product of a confrontation that went further than even Lazarus anticipated. McGough noted that this question may never be definitively answered, that even if Lazarus chose to fully confess, her account of her own mental state in those moments would not necessarily be reliable. Memory is not a perfect recorder, and the psychological mechanisms of self-justification and self-protection that have kept Lazarus functioning for 30-plus years are not mechanisms that switch off simply because one is being honest about the general facts of what happened. This epistemological humility, the willingness to acknowledge what cannot be known, even in a case where so much has been established, is something that the best journalism about real crime cases brings to the table. The truth of what happened in that apartment can be approximated through physical evidence and legal inference. The full truth of what was happening in Stephanie Lazarus's mind is something that exists only inside her, and that she has chosen, for most of the years since the murder, to keep sealed. What we know is enough for a verdict. What we know is enough for a sentence. But what we know is not everything, and the things we do not know, the interior life of a person capable of what Lazarus did, the specific emotional calculus that brought her to that door on that February morning, remain genuinely, permanently opaque. The television coverage of the case has brought it to millions of people who might not otherwise have encountered it. Dateline NBC's coverage, with correspondent Josh Mankiewicz reporting, treated the case with the seriousness it deserves, spending time not just on the crime and the investigation, but on Sherry herself, on the family's fight, on the meaning of what the eventual solution revealed about the limitations and possibilities of forensic science. The 2020 coverage, which aired in 2024 as new attention was drawn to the case by the parole hearings, brought Connie Rasmussen's voice directly to viewers who were encountering the case for the first time. These media treatments have kept Sherry Rasmussen's name alive. They have ensured that she is not forgotten, that the case is not allowed to quietly recede into the archives of legal history, while the perpetrator serves her sentence in relative obscurity. They have also, inevitably, contributed to the ongoing public conversation about the case, about the parole questions, about the LAPD's failures, about the broader implications of what happened and how it was handled. This matters because public attention, in cases like this one, is not merely voyeuristic. It is a form of accountability. When a large number of people know about a case and care about its outcome, the institutional actors who make decisions, the parole board, the governor's office, the LAPD, are operating in a context where their decisions are visible and subject to scrutiny. The Rasmussen family's ability to mobilize public attention through media coverage has been part of their ability to fight the parole battles. It is harder to quietly release someone from prison for a crime of this magnitude when the public is watching and knows what the crime was. The forensic science angle of the case has also attracted significant attention from the scientific and legal communities. The story of how DNA evidence was collected in 1986, stored for 15 years, analyzed in 2004, matched against a second sample in 2009, and ultimately used as the centerpiece of a successful prosecution in 2012, is a story about the power and the patience of science. It is a story that has been studied and cited in discussions about cold case investigative strategy, about the importance of proper evidence preservation and storage, and about the appropriate role of DNA evidence in criminal prosecutions. The bite mark evidence, specifically, raises questions that the forensic science community continues to grapple with. Bite mark analysis, the examination of the pattern of a bite wound and its comparison to the dental record of a suspect, is a forensic discipline that has faced significant scientific scrutiny in recent years. Studies have raised questions about the reliability of bite mark evidence as a form of identification. But in the Rasmussen case, the critical role of the bite mark was not primarily as a tool of identification through pattern analysis. It was as a carrier of biological material, a source of saliva and cellular material that could be swabbed and analyzed for DNA. The bite mark mattered not because of its shape, but because of what it held. That distinction is important and has been noted in discussions of the case's forensic significance. The Rasmussen case is also a significant data point in the broader conversation about the effectiveness and limitations of witness memory in long-duration cold cases. When investigators reopened the case in 2009 and began speaking to people who had known Sherry and John and Lazarus in the mid-1980s, They were asking those people to remember events that had taken place more than 2 decades earlier. Memory is fallible under the best of circumstances. After 23 years, it is even more so. Witnesses remembered things in general outline. The confrontation at the hospital, the name of the ex-girlfriend, the sense that something was wrong. But the specific details, the precise words, the exact sequence of events, had inevitably blurred and shifted. This is one of the reasons that the DNA evidence was so critical to the prosecution. The memory evidence, valuable as it was in constructing the motive and background narrative, could not alone have sustained a conviction. The physical evidence, the science, the biology, the genetic signature that 23 years had not erased, was what made the case prosecutable. And it raises one more question worth sitting with. How many other cases are sitting in evidence rooms somewhere, holding their answers in biological material that has never been analyzed? How many other bite marks, how many other blood samples, how many other pieces of physical evidence are stored in facilities across the country, waiting for the combination of scientific advancement and investigative will that would finally connect them to the crimes that generated them? The answer is a lot. The DNA revolution has not yet fully realized its potential for solving cold cases. There are thousands of cases, possibly tens of thousands, in which biological evidence exists and has not been tested. Some of those cases involve perpetrators who are still alive, who are still walking free, who may be living the same kind of double life that Stephanie Lazarus lived for 23 years. The existence of those unsolved cases is not inevitable. It is a choice made about resources and priorities and what kinds of justice are worth pursuing. The Rasmussen case is an argument, a powerful, documented, real-world argument, that the pursuit of those answers is worth it. That 23 years is not too long. That the truth, sealed in an evidence envelope or preserved in the biological material of a crime scene, will wait as long as it takes for someone to come looking. If you have stayed with this story from the beginning, if you have been listening through all the detail, all the pain, all the complexity of what this case revealed about institutions and human nature and the long fight for truth, then you already understand why it matters. But sometimes it is worth stepping back from the narrative and sitting with what it means. Not just what it means legally or forensically or institutionally. What it means in the way that true stories about real human beings always mean something that transcends the specific facts. What happened to Sherry Rasmussen was a crime. But the crime was embedded in a set of circumstances and relationships and institutional responses that made it not just a murder, but a sustained injustice. The murder took Sherry's life in a single morning. The failures of the investigation extended that injustice for 23 more years, denying her family the truth they deserved, allowing her killer to live freely, and adding to the grief of her parents a dimension of helpless, institutionally imposed silence that no family should ever have to endure. Nels Rasmussen walked into a police station in 1986 and told the truth. He told investigators what he knew, what he suspected, what Sherry had told him about the woman who frightened her. He was right. He was right about all of it. And he spent the rest of his life. He died in 2009, the year of the arrest, without being officially told that he had been right. He died knowing an arrest had been made. But he did not live to hear the verdict. He did not sit in that courtroom on March 8, 2012, and hear the word that confirmed what he had known since 1986. That is the particular grief of being believed too late. Loretta Rasmussen, Sherry's mother, lived to see the conviction. She sat in the courtroom and heard the verdict and felt whatever the complicated, layered, 26-year weight of waiting for that moment finally feels like when it arrives. Not simple relief. Not uncomplicated joy. Something more textured than either. The emotional equivalent of putting down something very heavy after carrying it for so long that the absence of the weight feels strange. Connie Rasmussen, Sherry's sister, became a voice that the world would hear directly. In interviews, in courtroom testimony, in parole hearing statements, in media appearances, Connie has spoken about her sister with a clarity and a love and a quiet ferocity that reflects the person she became through this ordeal. She was not a public figure before any of this. She did not choose to become one. But the case made her one, and she has used that platform with grace and purpose, not for herself, but for Sherry. To make sure that in every legal proceeding, in every news story, in every conversation about this case, the actual person at the center of it is not forgotten. John Rutan, whatever his own complicated relationship with this history, eventually made peace with the fact that what happened is now part of the permanent public record. He has spoken, in the context of parole hearings, with a directness about Lazarus and the crime that required him to revisit the darkest chapter of his life again and again. He has said clearly that he does not believe her remorse is genuine. He has stood beside Sherry's family in those hearing rooms and supported their fight. Whatever the complexities of his own past and his own role in the story that led to Sherry's death, he has tried to honor her memory in the years since. The investigators who finally solved the case, Jim Nuttall, Greg Stearns, and the team that worked alongside them, did something that the original investigation had failed to do. They followed the evidence. They did not let institutional loyalty or cognitive bias or the comfortable fiction of the burglary narrative get in the way of the truth. They looked at a fellow officer and, when the evidence pointed at her, they did not look away. That took courage of a particular kind. The kind that exists not in dramatic physical confrontations, but in the quiet, steadfast decision to do the job correctly, even when doing it correctly is uncomfortable and unwelcome and professionally risky. And the science. Always the science. The DNA that waited in a bite mark for 15 years before being tested, and then waited in an evidence database for 5 more years before being matched, and then did its work with the silent, inarguable precision of biology itself, indifferent to all the human failure that had surrounded it for 20 years. The science did not care about blue loyalty or narrative lock-in or institutional inertia. It just held the truth. And eventually, human beings, imperfect, fallible, institutional, sometimes courageous, sometimes cowardly, came looking for it. There are also questions that this case raises about the specific experience of women in law enforcement, and about the relationship between the professional identity of being a police officer and the human reality of the person behind the badge. Stephanie Lazarus was one of the early cohort of women to join the LAPD in significant numbers. She entered the department at a time when the culture was still heavily masculine, when women on the force were still navigating their place in an institution that had not been designed with them in mind. What that experience was like for her, how it shaped her sense of self, her relationships, her internal landscape, is something we do not fully know. None of that explains or excuses what she did, but it is part of the full picture of a human being who made a catastrophic choice and then spent 23 years living with it in a way that required her to construct an interior wall between what she knew and what she showed the world. That kind of compartmentalization, the ability to perform a professional identity with complete apparent sincerity while carrying the knowledge of what that professional identity was built on top of, is something that the psychological literature on deception and self-deception finds genuinely fascinating and genuinely troubling. She was, by all external measures, a good detective. People who worked with her at the art theft unit said she was smart, dedicated, effective. The work she did in that capacity, tracking stolen art, building cases against art thieves, using the investigative skills she had developed over a career to solve complex, evidence-dependent crimes, was real work, done well. The irony of that is almost too heavy to hold in the mind comfortably. A detective who solved cases, who knew how evidence works, who knew what investigators look for, who knew how to build a case from physical evidence and witness testimony. A detective who used all of that knowledge to escape the consequences of a case she herself had created. And then there is the parole story, which continues. Stephanie Lazarus is still in prison as of the time this script was written. She has been denied parole multiple times. The Rasmussen family continues to show up at each hearing and continues to argue, with the full force of everything they know and feel and have lost, that she should not be free. The system continues to process the competing claims, rehabilitation versus accountability, the science of youthful brain development versus the specific facts of a calculated, premeditated murder, the principle of mercy versus the principle of justice. This is not an abstraction. This is a real family, dealing with a real legal proceeding, fighting for a real principle, every time a hearing date is set. Connie Rasmussen, who is now in her late 60s, has spent decades living with this case in a way that no human being should have to. The resilience she has shown, the steadiness, the refusal to be silenced, the commitment to making sure that Sherry's name is heard in every room where decisions about her killer are made, is remarkable and deserves to be named as such. If you have been listening to this story tonight and feeling the weight of it, feeling the sadness of Sherry's death and the outrage of the institutional failures and the complicated, unresolved texture of a justice that came 26 years too late, then you have received something true from this case. Not just information, not just facts. The truth that some human stories do not resolve cleanly, that justice can be real and still be inadequate, that the fight for it never really ends. Sherry Rasmussen's story did not end when the verdict was read. It did not end when Lazarus was sentenced. It continues in the courtrooms where her family shows up and speaks her name. It continues in the work of investigators and forensic scientists who look at cold case evidence with new tools and the determination to find what was missed. It continues in the DNA database that grows every year, silently expanding the range of crimes it might one day help solve. It continues in the conversations that this case has generated about institutional accountability and forensic science, and what women owe themselves when something in their gut says that they are not safe. We have come a long way together tonight. A long way through the streets of Los Angeles in 1986, through the grief of a family that waited 23 years for an answer, through the corridors of a police department that failed one of its cases in the most profound way imaginable, through the laboratory where science finally did what human beings had not, and through the courtroom where the truth was finally, officially, irrevocably spoken. Before this story closes, before the last word is said, there are a few more things worth knowing and worth holding on to. Stephanie Lazarus, at her most recent parole hearing in early 2025, was again denied release. The parole board commissioner, in delivering that decision, noted specifically that her account of what happened on February 24, 1986, did not align with the physical evidence. She had, during the 2023 hearing, described the killing as the result of a confrontation that escalated, essentially characterizing it as a fight in which she was also a participant, not purely the aggressor. The physical evidence tells a different story. The staging of the scene, the use of a silencer, the cordage, the deliberateness of each step taken inside that apartment. These are not the marks of a mutual altercation. They are the marks of a planned assault. The commissioner said as much, directly and without softening. The family issued a statement after the 2025 denial that reflected the exhaustion that comes from a fight that is now approaching its fourth decade. Connie Rasmussen spoke about her sister. She said again what she has said before, what she will presumably continue to say for as long as parole hearings are scheduled and her voice holds. That Sherry deserved the life she was building, that the person who took it should not be free, and that the family will keep showing up to say so for as long as it takes. John Rutan, in statements made in the context of the parole proceedings, said something that has stayed with many people who have followed this case closely. He said that what happened was not an impulsive act, that it was skillful deception and complete disregard for the suffering of others. That Lazarus lied for decades until her only option was to pursue parole. He was speaking, in that moment, with the particular authority of someone who knew both women, who had been loved by both, in different ways and to vastly different degrees, and who has had to live with the knowledge that the casual choices of his youth became, in the most extreme way imaginable, consequential to someone else's survival. The DNA revolution that made this case solvable has continued to advance in the years since. The databases that hold genetic profiles have grown substantially. The techniques for extracting usable material from degraded or partial samples have improved. The integration of DNA databases across jurisdictions has made it possible to catch serial offenders who moved between states. Genealogical DNA testing, the use of publicly available ancestry databases to identify suspects whose DNA is in the system under a relative's name, has opened up an entirely new frontier of cold case investigation, solving murders and rapes and violent crimes that seemed permanently beyond reach. The Rasmussen case was not solved through genealogical DNA. It was solved through the more direct route of identifying a suspect through investigative reasoning and then confirming the identification through a covertly collected sample. But it was solved because someone preserved a swab in 1986, because the technology eventually caught up to what that swab could tell us, and because an investigator picked up a file that was about to be sent to the archives and decided to read it one more time. That last part, the decision to read it one more time, is worth sitting with. Jim Nuttall could have processed the Rasmussen file and moved on. He had other cases. He had other demands on his time and his attention. The file was old, the case was cold, and there was no particular urgency driving the decision to give it one more thorough review before filing it away. But he read it. Carefully. All of it. And he stopped on a detail that other people had not stopped on, or had not connected to its implications, and he followed that detail to where it led. That is what good detective work looks like. Not dramatic revelations. Not Hollywood moments of sudden clarity. It is a person, sitting with a document, reading carefully, thinking, following the logic to wherever it goes even when it goes somewhere uncomfortable. It is the willingness to be wrong, to revise your understanding of what a case is about when the evidence points in a direction that challenges your assumptions. And it is the courage to follow the evidence to a suspect who is, by every institutional and professional instinct, the last person you wanted to point to. The Rasmussen case is taught, in various contexts, as an example of what happens when these principles are followed and what happens when they are not. The original investigation is a case study in what goes wrong when a narrative is locked in too early. The reinvestigation is a case study in what goes right when an investigator comes to old evidence with fresh eyes and a willingness to be surprised. Together, they form a complete picture, a before and after, that is both instructive and, in the deepest way, heartbreaking. Because the before lasted 23 years, and the families who paid the price of that did not deserve to pay it. There is one final dimension of this story that deserves acknowledgement before this script concludes, and it is the dimension that is perhaps the hardest to hold comfortably. It is the question of what Sherry Rasmussen's life would have looked like if she had survived. She was 29 in 1986. If she were alive today, she would be in her late 60s, the same age as her sister Connie, who has spent those decades without her. She would have continued her career in nursing and hospital administration, almost certainly reaching heights that her trajectory was already pointing toward. She might have published. She might have advocated for healthcare policy. She might have trained hundreds of nurses who would have gone on to touch the lives of thousands of patients. She would have had decades more of her marriage to John, or not. The future is never predictable, but she would have had the future and all the choices that come with it. She might have had children. She almost certainly would have had grandchildren by now, had the mathematics of time been allowed to unfold. None of it happened, because on a February morning, a woman who could not accept that someone she wanted had chosen someone else made a decision that ended all of those possibilities permanently. The full accounting of what was lost, the patients Sherry would have cared for, the nurses she would have trained, the life she would have built, the people she would have loved and been loved by, is not a number that can be calculated. It is the kind of loss that exceeds arithmetic. And yet, Sherry Rasmussen is known. She is remembered. Her name is spoken in courtrooms and hearing rooms, and in conversations like this one, by people who never met her, but who have come to understand, through the story of her life and death and the fight for justice that followed, what she meant and what she was worth. The people who loved her made sure of that. They carried her name through 23 years of silence and into the light of a verdict and beyond. They refused to let her be reduced to a cold case number, to a file on a shelf, to a category in a database. She was Sherry Rasmussen, director of nursing, daughter, sister, wife. A woman who dedicated her professional life to caring for people in their most vulnerable moments. A woman who deserved more time and did not get it. That is the truth at the heart of everything. And now, finally, after all this time and all these words and all this grief, you know it too. The truth of this case waited for 23 years before it was officially acknowledged. It waited in an evidence envelope in a storage room. It waited in the cells of biology, patient and precise and utterly indifferent to the human failures that surrounded it. It waited in the hearts of a family that refused to let go. And when it finally came, when the DNA matched and the handcuffs closed and the verdict was read, it came not as a revelation but as a confirmation. A confirmation of what Nels Rasmussen had known since 1986. What Loretta Rasmussen had known. What the evidence, properly read, had been saying all along. The truth does not disappear. It only waits. And to all of you who have been with me through this entire journey tonight, whether you are in bed with the lights off, your phone face up on the pillow, or sitting in your favorite chair with a cup of tea going cold beside you, or walking somewhere in the dark with this voice in your ears, thank you. Thank you for listening to Sherry's story. Thank you for staying until the end. That matters more than you might think. If this video has moved you, if it has made you think, if it has given you something worth holding on to, then please take 30 seconds and press the like button. Subscribe to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories if you haven't already, so you never miss another story like this one. Leave a comment and tell me where you were watching from tonight, and which part of Sherry's story hit you the hardest. Was it the family's fight? The DNA breakthrough? The interrogation? Let me know. I read every single one. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, a friend, a sister, a mother, someone who cares about truth and justice and the fight for both, share this video with them. Sherry Rasmussen's name deserves to be spoken as widely as possible. The next story is already waiting. Stay with me. This has been Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. Good night, and stay safe out there.